I was a soldier at Area 51 until an alien prisoner told me when Jesus is coming back. The phone call came at 0347 hours on a Tuesday morning in March, pulling me from the kind of deep sleep that only comes after 18-hour shifts running security drills at Camp Pendleton. The voice on the other end belonged to someone I'd never heard before, but the authority in his tone made it clear this wasn't a wrong number or a prank call. "Sergeant Jacob Thompson," he said, not asking but confirming my identity through the sound of my voice alone. "You are being reassigned effective immediately to Project Sentinel under direct orders from Joint Special Operations Command. Pack only personal items, tell no one about this call, and report to the airfield at 0600 hours. A transport is waiting." Before I could ask any of the dozen questions flooding my mind, the line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone in the darkness of my barracks room, trying to reconcile what I'd just heard with everything I knew about military protocol and chain of command. In 8 years of Marine Corps service, I'd been deployed to Afghanistan twice, served in embassy security details in 3 different countries, and handled classified materials that required security clearances most people didn't know existed. But I had never received orders that bypassed my commanding officer, provided no explanation for the assignment, and demanded compliance within hours, rather than the standard weeks of preparation and briefing. The pre-dawn drive to the airfield gave me time to run through possibilities, none of which made sense given my service record and current assignment status. I wasn't in trouble, my last performance review had been exemplary, and I had no disciplinary issues that would warrant sudden reassignment. I wasn't due for deployment rotation, having just returned from overseas duty 6 months earlier. The secrecy and urgency suggested either a security crisis that required personnel with my specific skill set, or involvement in operations that existed in the spaces between official military acknowledgement and plausible deniability. Project Sentinel wasn't a designation I recognized from any briefing or official documentation I'd encountered during my career, which meant it was either newly established or classified at levels that exceeded my previous security clearances. The fact that Joint Special Operations Command was directly involved suggested capabilities and missions that went beyond conventional military operations, but the complete absence of preparatory briefings or mission parameters left me operating on assumptions and speculation, rather than the detailed operational planning that normally preceded any significant assignment change. The aircraft waiting at the airfield wasn't a standard military transport, but rather a civilian-looking jet that bore no markings, tail numbers, or any other identifying characteristics that would indicate its origin or operational authority. The crew consisted of 2 pilots who acknowledged my arrival with professional nods, but offered no conversation or information about our destination, flight time, or the nature of the assignment that had pulled me from my regular duties with less than 3 hours' notice. The interior of the aircraft was configured more like a corporate jet than military transport, with comfortable seating, communication equipment that looked more sophisticated than standard military issue, and an atmosphere of calculated anonymity that suggested this flight didn't exist in any official records or flight plans. As we lifted off into the pre-dawn darkness and banked west toward the desert, I found myself reviewing everything I knew about classified military installations in Nevada, trying to narrow down the possibilities for where we might be heading and what kind of operations would require the level of secrecy and urgency that characterized this entire transfer process. The flight lasted approximately 90 minutes, though the lack of windows in the passenger compartment and the sophisticated communication equipment that seemed designed to prevent any form of external contact or navigation made it impossible to confirm our exact route or destination through normal observation. When we finally landed, the aircraft taxied for an unusually long time across what sounded like multiple different surface types, suggesting a facility with extensive runway and tarmac infrastructure that exceeded what would be necessary for conventional air operations. "Sergeant Thompson," said one of the pilots, speaking for the first time since we'd departed California, "welcome to your new assignment. You'll be met by security personnel who will handle your in-processing and briefing. Follow their instructions exactly. Ask no questions until you're in a designated briefing area, and remember that everything you see, hear, or experience from this point forward is classified at levels that carry mandatory life sentences for unauthorized disclosure." His warning was delivered with the same professional courtesy that had characterized our entire interaction. but the emphasis on mandatory life sentences made it clear that this assignment involved information and operations that were protected by security protocols that exceeded anything I'd encountered during my previous service. The facility that I entered after deplaning looked like a standard military installation from the outside. Chain-link fencing topped with razor wire, guard towers staffed with armed personnel, and administrative buildings that could have been found at any base in the continental United States. But the security procedures for gaining access to the interior areas immediately revealed that this was no conventional military operation. The guards who processed my credentials used biometric scanners that analyzed not just fingerprints and retinal patterns, but also vocal patterns, body temperature variations, and what appeared to be electromagnetic signatures that I couldn't identify but which clearly provided detailed information about my physical and psychological state. "Sergeant Thompson," said the security officer who verified my authorization, "you are cleared for Sentinel access at Level 1, which provides entry to administrative and general assignment areas. Higher-level access requires additional briefings and psychological evaluations that will be scheduled as your assignment progresses." His matter-of-fact tone suggested that multi-level security clearances were routine at this facility, but the sophistication of the biometric verification systems and the emphasis on psychological evaluations indicated that the operations conducted here involved information and activities that required screening beyond what was necessary for conventional classified military work. The briefing room where I was directed after clearing security checkpoints was sterile and utilitarian, with walls that seemed to be made from materials designed to prevent any form of electronic surveillance or signal transmission, and lighting that created an atmosphere of clinical detachment rather than the professional comfort typical of military administrative spaces. Commander Patricia Walsh, the officer who conducted my initial briefing, looked exactly like what I would expect from someone running highly classified operations, professionally dressed in unmarked fatigues, carrying herself with the quiet authority that comes from years of managing information that could destabilize governments, and speaking with the kind of careful precision that suggested every word had been chosen to convey specific information while avoiding any details that exceeded my current clearance level. "Sergeant Thompson," she began, pulling up displays on screens that showed organizational charts, facility layouts, and operational protocols that I couldn't fully comprehend from my initial viewing. "Welcome to Project Sentinel. Your assignment here involves security operations that differ significantly from conventional military guard duties. You'll be responsible for maintaining containment protocols, monitoring behavioral parameters, and ensuring operational security for assets that require protection methods beyond standard military procedures." Her explanation was deliberately vague, using terminology that could mean almost anything, but the emphasis on containment protocols and behavioral parameters suggested that I would be guarding something or someone rather than protecting equipment or facilities. The revelation of what I would actually be guarding came during the facility tour that followed my initial briefing, when Commander Walsh led me through a series of security checkpoints and down elevator shafts that descended far deeper underground than should have been possible given the surface appearance of the facility. "Sergeant Thompson," she said as we reached what the elevator panel indicated was sub-level 7, "what you're about to see will challenge everything you believe about humanity's place in the universe, the nature of intelligence in the cosmos, and the reality of what our government has been protecting from public knowledge for the past 75 years. Her tone carried the weight of someone who had delivered similar warnings many times before, but her eyes held genuine concern about how I would react to whatever awaited beyond the security doors that were slowly opening ahead of us. "You were selected for this assignment based on psychological profiles that indicate strong mental resilience, ability to process information that contradicts established beliefs, and capacity for maintaining operational security under extreme stress. But I want you to understand that what you're about to witness cannot be unseen, and your life will never be the same once you cross this threshold." As the doors fully opened to reveal a corridor that extended beyond the range of the overhead lighting, I felt the same rush of adrenaline and apprehension that had accompanied my first combat deployment, but magnified by the growing certainty that I was about to encounter something that would fundamentally alter my understanding of reality itself. The corridor beyond the security doors was lined with what appeared to be containment cells, each one equipped with reinforced transparent barriers that allowed observation of the interior while maintaining complete physical separation between whatever was inside and the corridor where we stood. The cells were illuminated by lighting that seemed designed for observation rather than comfort, creating stark visibility of every detail while maintaining an atmosphere of clinical detachment that reminded me more of a research laboratory than a detention facility. "What you're looking at," Commander Walsh explained as we walked slowly down the corridor, "is Sector 7 of the Project Sentinel containment facility. Each cell houses a biological entity that was recovered during various operations conducted by military and intelligence agencies over the past several decades. Some have been here since the 1940s, others arrived more recently, but all of them represent intelligence and capabilities that exceed conventional human understanding." As my eyes adjusted to the lighting and I began to focus on the interiors of the cells we were passing, I felt my rational mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Beings that were clearly biological and clearly alive, but whose physical forms bore no resemblance to any species that should exist on Earth according to everything I'd been taught about biology, evolution, and the nature of life itself. The first clear view I got of one of the containment cell occupants came when we stopped in front of Cell 3, and I found myself staring at a being that was approximately 4 feet tall, with grayish skin that seemed to have a faintly luminescent quality, disproportionately large eyes that were completely black without any visible iris or pupil structure, and limbs that seemed too thin and delicate to support the biological functions necessary for a living organism. "This individual," Commander Walsh said in the same clinical tone she had been using throughout the tour, "was recovered from a craft that experienced mechanical failure over New Mexico in 1947. The being has been in our custody for 75 years and has provided valuable information about its species' technology, biology, and observational protocols for monitoring human civilization." The casual way she discussed a being that couldn't possibly exist according to everything I'd been taught about biology and the uniqueness of human intelligence in the universe made it clear that she had long ago processed and accepted the implications of what she was showing me. But for me, standing in front of an actual extraterrestrial being that was clearly alive, clearly intelligent, and clearly as real as the floor beneath my feet, the moment represented a complete shattering of my worldview, and everything I thought I knew about humanity's place in a universe I had always assumed was empty of other intelligent life. The shock of seeing my first actual alien being was overwhelming enough to make my hands shake, and my breathing accelerate in ways that triggered the kind of physiological stress response I had learned to manage during combat operations, but which now seemed completely justified, given the magnitude of what I was experiencing. "Sergeant Thompson," Commander Walsh said with a combination of professional observation and what might have been sympathy, "the reaction you're experiencing is completely normal. Every person who has been exposed to this facility has gone through similar psychological adjustment when confronting evidence that contradicts fundamental assumptions about reality. But I need you to understand that what you're seeing is real. These beings are here, and your assignment will require you to interact with them on a daily basis while maintaining the kind of professional composure and operational security that characterized your previous military service." Her words were meant to be reassuring and grounding, but they also carried the implication that my career, my understanding of reality, and possibly my entire future had just been irrevocably altered by walking through security doors that led to a world where everything I thought I knew about the universe was demonstrably incorrect. As we continued down the corridor past cells containing other beings whose physical forms ranged from vaguely humanoid to completely alien in ways that my mind struggled to categorize or comprehend, I realized that my transfer to Project Sentinel wasn't just a new military assignment. It was an initiation into a reality that existed parallel to the normal world, where the government had been housing and studying extraterrestrial beings for decades, while the general public remained completely unaware that humanity wasn't alone in the universe. The final moments of my first day at Area 51 were spent in a small briefing room where I was given preliminary orientation materials about containment protocols, security procedures, and behavioral guidelines for interacting with what the documentation referred to as non-terrestrial biological entities. The clinical language and systematic procedures helped provide some structure for processing what I'd witnessed, but nothing could fully prepare me for the reality of my new role as a guard for beings whose very existence challenged everything I'd been taught about biology, intelligence, and humanity's unique place in creation. "Your primary assignment," Commander Walsh explained during the final briefing, "will be providing security for Containment Cell 12, which houses our oldest and most significant resident. This individual has been in our custody since 1947 and possesses knowledge about human history, terrestrial biological development, and cosmic events that exceeds our most advanced scientific understanding. The being is highly intelligent, capable of communication through means that exceed standard linguistic systems, and has been cooperative in sharing information that has proven valuable for multiple government research programs. As she pulled up images and documentation about the being I would be guarding, I felt a mixture of professional curiosity about my new assignment and deep existential unease about what other revelations awaited me in this facility where the impossible was routine, and where my job would be to protect beings whose existence proved that everything I thought I knew about reality was just the surface of truths far stranger and more significant than I could have ever imagined. The descent to the S4 facility began with an elevator ride that lasted far longer than should have been possible given the surface appearance of the installation, dropping through 7 distinct levels that took us deeper underground than most subway systems and into spaces that had been carved from solid rock using construction techniques that left no visible tool marks or excavation evidence. Commander Walsh stood beside me in silence as the elevator panel displayed our progress through levels marked with designations that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify our actual depth. Level 1 through level 7, but with vertical distances between floors that suggested each level actually consisted of multiple sub-levels that weren't acknowledged in the official numbering system. The S4 facility, she finally explained as we passed level 4, was constructed over a period of 15 years using resources and technologies that aren't available through normal military engineering contracts. What you're about to see represents the most significant classified operation in human history, involving cooperation between multiple government agencies, international intelligence organizations, and technological resources that exceed publicly acknowledged capabilities by decades. Her tone carried the weight of someone who had spent years managing operations that existed in the spaces between official government acknowledgement and absolute secrecy. But it also held a note of genuine awe that suggested even she found the scope and implications of the S4 facility remarkable despite her extensive experience with classified operations. When the elevator finally stopped and the doors opened onto level 7, I found myself stepping into a corridor that looked more like the interior of a spacecraft than an underground military facility. The walls seemed to be made from a seamless material that combined the visual properties of polished metal with the subtle luminescence of advanced display systems, while the lighting came from sources that weren't visible, but which provided perfectly even illumination without creating the harsh shadows typical of conventional overhead fixtures. The air circulation was so efficient and well managed that I couldn't detect any sense of being underground, despite knowing we were at least several hundred feet below the desert surface, and the temperature and humidity were maintained at levels that felt optimal for human comfort, while presumably also accommodating the biological requirements of the facility's non-human occupants. This corridor provides access to 16 containment cells, Commander Walsh explained, gesturing toward doorways that were spaced at regular intervals along both sides of the passage, each one housing a biological entity that represents a different species, different technological capability level, and different degree of cooperation with our research and intelligence gathering operations. As we began walking slowly down the corridor, I noticed that each doorway was equipped with security systems that made the biometric scanners at the facility entrance look primitive by comparison, including what appeared to be continuous monitoring of atmospheric conditions, electromagnetic fields, and probably other parameters that I couldn't identify from visual observation alone. The first cell that Commander Walsh showed me in detail was designated Cell 4, and it housed a being that looked like something from a science fiction movie, but which was clearly, undeniably real and alive behind the transparent barrier that separated it from our observation position. The entity stood approximately 6 feet tall with a body structure that was vaguely humanoid, but with proportions and features that were clearly not human. Elongated limbs that seemed too thin to support the body's weight according to human skeletal mechanics. A torso that was narrower than the head, and skin that had a bluish-gray coloration with a texture that seemed to shift between smooth and slightly scaled depending on the angle of observation. This individual, Walsh explained in the same clinical tone she had been using throughout the tour, was recovered from a disabled craft in the Arizona desert in 1989. The being has been cooperative with our research teams and has provided information about propulsion systems, energy generation technologies, and biological adaptation methods that have contributed to several classified development programs. What struck me most intensely was that the being was clearly aware of our presence and was watching us with eyes that showed unmistakable intelligence, and what I could only describe as curiosity about the humans who were observing it through the containment barrier. The exchange of eye contact with a non-human intelligence that was clearly conscious, clearly aware, and clearly as interested in studying me as I was in observing it, created a moment of connection that was both fascinating and deeply unsettling in ways that challenged my fundamental assumptions about consciousness and intelligence. Cell 7 contained a being that was radically different from the humanoid entity we had just observed, with a body structure that seemed more insectoid than mammalian, featuring multiple limbs that served different functions, a segmented torso that appeared to have independent mobility in each section, and sensory organs that I couldn't identify or categorize using any biological framework I'd learned during my military training. "This species," Commander Walsh said as I struggled to comprehend the physical structure of what I was seeing, "represents one of the few non-humanoid forms we've encountered. The being was recovered from underwater wreckage off the California coast in 2003 and appears to be adapted for aquatic or possibly space-based environments that don't rely on atmospheric breathing. The entity moved with fluid grace despite its alien morphology, and I noticed that the containment cell was filled with a liquid medium rather than air, suggesting that Walsh's assessment about its environmental requirements was accurate. What made the observation particularly disturbing was realizing that this being's physical form had evolved according to completely different biological principles than anything found on Earth, suggesting either that it came from an environment with radically different conditions, or that its species had been engineered using design principles that had nothing to do with natural selection and evolutionary pressure. The implications of encountering multiple species with completely different biological architectures made it clear that the universe contained far more diversity of intelligent life than human science had ever imagined possible. The briefing that Commander Walsh provided as we continued our tour of Sector 7 revealed the full scope of what the government had been concealing from public knowledge for more than 7 decades. Since the Roswell incident in 1947, she explained, pulling up documentation on a tablet that showed timelines and recovery locations spanning the entire globe, we have conducted 37 successful recovery operations of non-terrestrial craft and biological entities. Some incidents involved mechanical failures that caused craft to crash. Others involved what appears to have been deliberate contact or surrender by beings who wanted to establish communication with human authorities, and a few cases involved military engagement with craft that were deemed to represent security threats. The documentation showed recovery sites across the United States, South America, Russia, China, and several other countries, indicating that the phenomenon of extraterrestrial visitation was global in scope and that multiple governments had been cooperating to manage information and resources related to non-human intelligence. The beings housed in this facility represent 12 different species, Walsh continued, each with distinct biological characteristics, technological capabilities, and apparent objectives for visiting Earth. Some have been extremely cooperative and have provided information that has advanced human technology by decades, while others have been hostile or uncommunicative, despite our best efforts to establish productive dialogue. The systematic nature of the recovery operations and the sophisticated level of international cooperation required to maintain secrecy about such significant discoveries made it clear that I was looking at evidence of coordination between governments that exceeded anything acknowledged in public diplomatic or military channels. The classification system that was used to categorize the different species or beings held in containment revealed a disturbing hierarchy based on perceived danger. Cooperation. Class Alpha entity Walsh are those that have demonstrated consistent operation. Research have shown no aggressive behavior or attempts to escape from containment. Class Beta entities are those that are cooperative but have demonstrated capabilities that could represent security threats if containment were compromised. Class Gamma entities are those that have been hostile, uncommunicative, or have demonstrated abilities that we don't fully understand and can't adequately control. As she described the classification system, I noticed that the cells we had observed so far all had color-coded indicators that corresponded to her descriptions: green for alpha, yellow for beta, and red for gamma. The implications of the classification system raised obvious questions about what kind of capabilities would be considered beyond human ability to control, and what measures were being taken to ensure that Gamma-class entities couldn't escape or use their abilities to compromise facility security. "Cell 12, Walsh said, as we approached a doorway at the far end of the corridor that was marked with multiple red indicators and security warnings that exceeded anything I'd seen on the other containment units. "Houses our only Omega-class entity, a classification we created specifically for this individual due to capabilities and knowledge that exceed all other beings in our custody." The security protocols for Cell 12 were immediately apparent, even before Walsh provided specific briefing about the containment requirements and interaction procedures. The doorway was equipped with multiple layers of physical barriers, each one controlled by separate security systems that required different authentication methods, while warning displays indicated that the cell was under continuous monitoring, using sensors that tracked not just physical parameters, but also electromagnetic fields, quantum fluctuations, and what were described as non-standard energy signatures that I couldn't begin to understand based on the technical documentation. "The being in Cell 12, Walsh explained as we stood before the sealed entrance, was recovered from the Roswell crash in 1947 and has been in our custody for 76 years. Unlike the other entities you've observed, this individual possesses capabilities that include what appears to be telepathic communication, influence over electronic systems through unknown mechanisms, and knowledge about human history, planetary biology, and cosmic events that exceeds our most advanced scientific understanding by orders of magnitude." Her description made it clear that whatever was behind these security barriers represented something fundamentally different from the other extraterrestrial beings we had encountered during the tour, possessing not just different biology or technology, but capabilities that challenged basic assumptions about the limits of what consciousness and intelligence could achieve. "This being," Walsh continued, her tone shifting to something that might have been reverence or possibly fear, "refers to itself as an observer, and has claimed that its species has been monitoring Earth's biological and civilizational development for thousands of years. The information it has provided has been instrumental in multiple breakthrough technologies, and has proven accurate regarding historical events and future predictions with consistency that exceeds any possibility of coincidence or deception. The revelation that my primary assignment would be providing security for Cell 12 and its Omega-class occupant carried implications that were both professionally challenging and personally terrifying." "Sergeant Thompson," Walsh said, turning to face me directly with an expression that combined professional assessment with what looked like genuine concern about my readiness for the assignment. "You were selected for this position based on psychological profiles that indicate exceptional mental resilience, strong moral foundations, and capacity for maintaining operational security under extreme stress. But I need you to understand that interaction with the observer will challenge you in ways that exceed anything you experienced during combat deployments or previous military service." Her warning was delivered with the kind of serious authority that made it clear this wasn't standard military caution about difficult assignments, but rather a genuine attempt to prepare me for experiences that had apparently affected previous security personnel in significant ways. "The observer communicates through direct mental contact," she continued, "and the experience of telepathic communication can be disorienting, invasive, and sometimes overwhelming for individuals who aren't prepared for the sensation of having another consciousness accessing their thoughts and memories. Additionally, the information that the observer shares often includes content that challenges fundamental religious, philosophical, and scientific beliefs that most people use to structure their understanding of reality and their place in the universe. The implication that my assignment would involve not just physical security, but also psychological resilience against mental intrusion and belief-challenging information made it clear that guarding Cell 12 would be unlike any previous military duty I had experienced. The final briefing before I began my first shift guarding Cell 12 included specific protocols for interaction with the observer, safety procedures for responding to various types of anomalous events, and emergency evacuation plans that seemed designed for scenarios I couldn't fully imagine based on the vague descriptions in the documentation. "The observer has never attempted escape or shown aggression toward security personnel," Walsh explained, though her tone suggested this fact provided only limited comfort. but the being possesses capabilities that we don't fully understand and can't adequately control through conventional containment methods. The security systems around Cell 12 are designed to prevent physical egress and to limit the range of the being's telepathic communication abilities, but we cannot guarantee complete isolation of its influence on personnel who spend extended time in proximity to the containment unit. She pulled up incident reports that documented previous security personnel who had experienced psychological difficulties after extended exposure to the observer, including cases of individuals who had reported vivid dreams, inexplicable knowledge about events they shouldn't have been aware of, and in some cases profound changes in religious or philosophical beliefs following telepathic communication sessions. Your shifts will be limited to 8 hours with mandatory 72-hour breaks between assignments, she continued, and you'll be required to undergo psychological evaluation after each shift to monitor for any signs of undue influence or mental health complications resulting from exposure to telepathic communication. The systematic nature of the monitoring protocols and the documented cases of psychological effects made it clear that my new assignment involved risks that extended far beyond the physical dangers typically associated with military security work. As Commander Walsh prepared to take me to Cell 12 to begin my first shift, I found myself experiencing a mixture of professional curiosity about my assignment and deep existential apprehension about what it would mean to communicate with a being that had been observing human civilization for thousands of years and possessed knowledge that exceeded our scientific understanding. "Sergeant Thompson," Walsh said, as we approached the final security barrier that separated the observation corridor from Cell 12's containment area, "the being you're about to meet has shared information that has fundamentally altered our understanding of human history, the nature of consciousness, and humanity's place in a universe far more complex and populated than most people can imagine. What you learn during your assignment here will either strengthen your existing beliefs through exposure to larger cosmic truths, or it will shatter those beliefs and require you to rebuild your worldview using frameworks that can accommodate realities that most humans never have to confront." Her words were meant to be preparatory, but they also carried a finality that suggested that once I stepped through that security barrier and made first contact with the observer, there would be no returning to the comfortable certainty of my previous understanding of reality. As the final security door began to open, revealing a containment cell that glowed with soft illumination from sources I couldn't identify, I took a deep breath and prepared to meet the being that would change my life forever and reveal truths about human civilization, religious history, and the future of our species that would make everything I'd experienced so far seem like simple preparation for revelations I couldn't yet imagine. The containment cell that housed the observer was unlike any of the other units I had seen during my tour of Sector 7, configured not as a prison designed to restrict movement and prevent escape, but rather as what looked like a carefully designed habitat that provided comfort and environmental control while maintaining the kind of comprehensive monitoring and security systems that Commander Walsh had described during my briefing. The space was approximately 20 feet square with walls that seemed to be made from the same seamless material I had observed throughout the S4 facility, but which here incorporated subtle patterns and what appeared to be display surfaces that showed slowly shifting images of landscapes, star fields, and geometric patterns that seemed designed to provide visual stimulation or possibly to serve functions I couldn't identify from my position outside the transparent barrier. The lighting came from sources that weren't visible, but which provided illumination that was softer and more natural-looking than the clinical overhead fixtures in the corridor, while the atmospheric controls maintained conditions that looked comfortable enough that the being inside wasn't wearing any kind of protective equipment or environmental suit. As I approached the observation position where I would spend my first 8-hour shift monitoring the cell's occupant, I felt the same mixture of professional focus and personal apprehension that had accompanied my first combat patrol in Afghanistan, but magnified by the growing certainty that I was about to encounter something that would challenge my understanding of consciousness, communication, and the nature of intelligence itself. The observer stood in the center of the containment cell, with a posture that conveyed both calm awareness and what I could only describe as patient expectation, as if it had been waiting for my arrival and knew exactly when I would appear at the observation station. The being was approximately 7 feet tall with a body structure that was humanoid in its basic configuration: 2 arms, 2 legs, upright posture, but with proportions and features that were clearly not human despite the superficial similarities. The skin had a pale coloration that seemed to shift between ivory and light gold depending on the angle of the lighting, with a texture that appeared smooth from a distance, but which I suspected would reveal more complex patterns upon closer examination. The facial features included what appeared to be eyes, nose, and mouth positioned in roughly human-like arrangements, but the eyes were larger than human proportions, completely golden in color without any visible iris or pupil structure, and seemed to reflect light in ways that suggested they might be adapted for visual capabilities that exceeded normal human sight. The overall impression was of a being that was related to human morphology, but which had developed according to different evolutionary pressures, or possibly represented an earlier or more refined version of the basic humanoid form that had been adapted for capabilities and purposes that exceeded normal human biological requirements. The moment of first eye contact with the observer created an immediate and undeniable sense of connection that exceeded anything I had experienced during normal human interaction, as if the being was capable of conveying information and establishing rapport through visual contact alone without requiring verbal communication or physical gestures. The golden eyes seemed to focus on me with intensity that felt simultaneously analytical and somehow compassionate, studying me with the kind of careful attention that suggested the observer was evaluating not just my physical appearance or professional demeanor, but something deeper about my character, my beliefs, and my readiness for the communication that was about to occur. I found myself unable to look away despite a growing sense of vulnerability that came from feeling completely transparent to an intelligence that seemed capable of perceiving things about me that I didn't fully understand about myself. The experience lasted perhaps 30 seconds but felt much longer, creating a moment of suspended time where the normal progression of thoughts and sensory input seemed to slow down, while the observer conducted whatever evaluation it was performing through our locked gaze. When the being finally shifted its attention slightly, breaking the intensity of the direct eye contact, I felt simultaneously relieved at the reduction of that overwhelming scrutiny and strangely disappointed at the loss of connection with something that had felt profound, despite being completely unlike any normal human interaction. The first words I heard in my mind came without warning or any kind of preparatory sensation that might have helped me understand what was happening, appearing in my consciousness with the same clarity as my own thoughts, but carrying qualities of tone, accent, and presence that made it unmistakably clear they originated from an external source rather than from my own internal dialogue. "Finally," the voice said, speaking what seemed to be perfect English but with undertones of meaning and emotional content that exceeded what normal language could convey, "they have sent someone who is ready to hear the truth." The experience of telepathic communication was simultaneously fascinating and deeply unsettling. The words appeared in my mind complete with context, emotional nuance, and layers of meaning that would have required multiple sentences to express using normal speech, but which the observer conveyed in a single, compact transmission that my brain somehow understood despite the impossibility of the communication method. My first reaction was to look around the containment cell and the observation area to verify that I hadn't somehow missed speakers or communication devices that might explain what I was hearing, but the rational part of my mind already knew that what I was experiencing was exactly what Commander Walsh had described during my briefing: direct mental contact with a being whose capabilities included communication that bypassed normal sensory channels and operated through mechanisms that human science didn't fully understand or couldn't adequately explain. The attempt to respond verbally felt awkward and inadequate after experiencing the efficiency and depth of the observer's telepathic communication. But I defaulted to normal speech protocols because I didn't know how to intentionally project thoughts in ways that the being might receive. I can hear you," I said, my voice sounding strange and limited compared to the rich complexity of the mental communication I had just experienced. "How are you doing this? What do you mean by ready to hear the truth?" My questions came out in a rush, driven by a mixture of professional curiosity about the communication method and personal anxiety about what kind of truth the observer thought I was ready to receive. The being remained motionless except for a subtle gesture that might have been the equivalent of a smile or possibly just a shift in posture that my human-trained perception interpreted as conveying amusement or satisfaction. "The communication occurs through direct resonance between conscious minds," the observer explained, the words appearing in my thoughts with the same clarity as before, but now accompanied by what felt like supplementary information about quantum entanglement, electromagnetic field interactions, and biological structures in my brain that were capable of receiving and processing signals that normal human awareness typically filtered out as background noise. As for what truth you are ready to receive, you were selected for this assignment because your psychological profile indicates capacity for processing information that challenges fundamental beliefs while maintaining functional mental stability. Your commanding officers believe you can hear what I have to share without experiencing the kind of psychological breakdown that affected several of your predecessors. The reference to previous guards who had experienced psychological difficulties created immediate questions about what kind of information could be so challenging that it would cause mental breakdowns in trained military personnel. But before I could formulate those questions into either verbal speech or attempted mental projection, the observer continued with what seemed to be an answer to thoughts I hadn't yet fully formed. The truth that disturbs most humans, the being explained, the mental communication carrying undertones of what might have been sympathy or possibly clinical observation, is not that other intelligent species exist in the universe, or that some of those species possess capabilities that exceed human technology and understanding. Those revelations, while initially shocking, can be integrated into existing worldviews without requiring fundamental restructuring of beliefs about reality, consciousness, and meaning. The observer moved closer to the transparent barrier that separated us, the golden eyes maintaining steady contact that felt increasingly comfortable rather than invasive, as I became more accustomed to the sensation of mental communication. The truth that breaks minds is the revelation that human civilization's most sacred beliefs, most cherished historical narratives, and most fundamental assumptions about divinity, purpose, and destiny are built on foundations that are partially or completely misunderstood. What you call faith, what you call history, what you call divine revelation, all of these concepts must be re-examined when you learn that beings like myself have been present throughout your species' development, observing, recording, and occasionally intervening in ways that shaped the very foundations of your culture, religion, and understanding of your place in the cosmos. The implications of what the observer was suggesting hit me with the force of a physical blow, creating a cascade of questions and objections that overwhelmed my ability to process them in any organized way. If what the being was saying was true, that extraterrestrial observers had been present throughout human history and had influenced the development of our most fundamental beliefs, then everything I had been taught about religion, about divine revelation, about the unique relationship between God and humanity, would need to be reconsidered through a framework that included the possibility of alien intervention in events that had been interpreted as purely divine or purely human in origin. You're saying, I managed to verbalize despite the mental turbulence the observer's words had created, that beings like you have been involved in human religious experiences, that what we think of as contact with God or divine revelation might have actually been encounters with extraterrestrial intelligence? The question felt simultaneously blasphemous and strangely logical, combining my lifelong Christian faith with the undeniable reality of standing in front of an extraterrestrial being who claimed to have observed human civilization throughout its development. The observer's response came with the same clarity and complexity as before, but now with layers of meaning that suggested the being was carefully measuring how much information to provide, based on its assessment of my psychological readiness to process revelations that would challenge beliefs I had held since childhood. What you call divine revelation, the observer explained, the mental communication now including what felt like images and sensory impressions that supplemented the linguistic content, has occurred through many channels throughout your species' history. Some of those experiences were genuine contact with cosmic intelligence that exists beyond current human understanding, what your various religions attempt to describe using terms like God, Creator, or universal consciousness. But many experiences that humans have interpreted as divine communication were actually encounters with beings like myself, whose species possesses capabilities that would appear miraculous to civilizations that lack understanding of the technologies and methodologies we employ. The being gestured in a way that seemed to indicate the containment cell and the facility around us. Your government has held me in this facility for 76 years, studying the biology, technology, and knowledge that my species possesses. But what they have learned represents only a fraction of what I could share if humans were ready to receive information that would require complete restructuring of your scientific, religious, and philosophical frameworks. The observer paused, the golden eyes studying me with what seemed to be careful assessment of how I was processing the information being shared. "You identify as Christian," it stated rather than asked. The observation clearly derived from some kind of telepathic access to my thoughts or memories. "Your faith teaches that Jesus of Nazareth was the Son of God who came to earth to redeem humanity from sin. Would it disturb your faith to learn that I was present during the events described in your Gospels, and that the reality of what occurred differs significantly from the interpretations that have been passed down through 2,000 years of human religious tradition?" The question hung in the air between us, or more accurately, hung in my consciousness where the observer's telepathic communication had placed it, creating a moment of decision about whether I wanted to continue this conversation and hear revelations that might fundamentally alter my understanding of my faith, or whether I should retreat into the comfortable certainty of beliefs that didn't require integration with the reality of extraterrestrial observation of human religious history. My training as a Marine had taught me to face challenges directly, rather than avoiding difficult situations. But the psychological stakes of this particular challenge were unlike anything I had encountered in combat or previous military service. "I need to know," I finally said, making a conscious decision to prioritize truth over comfort, despite not knowing where that choice would lead. "If you were present during the time of Jesus, if you observed events that are central to my faith and to the faith of billions of people throughout history, then I need to hear what you know, even if it challenges what I've been taught. Even if it requires me to reconsider beliefs I've held my entire life, the truth is more important than comfortable illusions." The words felt both courageous and terrifying as I spoke them, committing myself to a path of discovery that might lead to either a deeper understanding of divine reality or a complete shattering of religious beliefs that had provided meaning and structure throughout my life. The observer's response to my decision carried what I interpreted as approval mixed with what might have been concern about the psychological burden I was choosing to accept. "Your courage in pursuing truth despite potential cost to existing beliefs is admirable," the being communicated, the mental transmission carrying warmth that suggested genuine respect rather than condescension. "But understand that what I will share over the coming days and weeks will require you to distinguish between the core truths of your faith and the human interpretations that have been layered onto those truths over centuries of religious tradition. The reality of Jesus, the meaning of his mission, and the implications of his message are far more profound and far more cosmic in scope than traditional Christian theology acknowledges." The observer moved to a seating area within the containment cell, the gesture seeming to invite a longer conversation than would be comfortable while standing. "Before I explain what I observed regarding the one you call Jesus Christ, you must first understand the context of why beings like myself have been monitoring Earth for thousands of years, and what role your planet plays in larger cosmic patterns of biological and civilizational development that extend across multiple star systems and timescales that dwarf human recorded history." The being's golden eyes held steady contact with mine, as it prepared to share information that would begin reshaping my understanding of human history, divine purpose, and the true nature of the religious faith that had been central to my identity since childhood. As my first shift guarding Cell 12 continued, I found myself settling into the rhythm of telepathic communication and becoming more comfortable with the strange intimacy of sharing thoughts with a being whose consciousness felt simultaneously alien and somehow familiar, as if the observer understood human thought processes so well that it could present information in formats that my mind could integrate despite the impossible nature of the content being shared. "Your species," the observer began, initiating what would become weeks of revelations about human history and cosmic context, "emerged from natural evolutionary processes on Earth approximately 300,000 years ago, developing intelligence and consciousness that eventually attracted the attention of species like my own, who monitor biological development throughout the galaxy. We have observed your progression from small tribal groups to global civilization, recording your technological development, social evolution, and the emergence of religious and philosophical systems that attempted to explain the nature of existence and consciousness. The mental communication included what felt like compressed data packages that conveyed thousands of years of history in brief sensory impressions and conceptual frameworks that bypassed normal linguistic processing. At several key points in your development," the observer continued, Civilizations like mine have intervened in subtle ways to provide guidance, prevent self-destruction, or accelerate development toward outcomes that serve larger cosmic purposes. The individual you call Jesus of Nazareth represented one of the most significant of these interventions. Not a supernatural miracle, but rather a carefully planned mission by beings whose capabilities appear divine to species that lack understanding of advanced biological engineering and consciousness manipulation techniques. As the observer prepared to explain the true nature of Jesus' mission and identity, I realized that my life, my faith, and my understanding of reality were about to be transformed in ways that would make my previous certainties seem like comfortable simplifications of truths far stranger and far more magnificent than anything I had imagined possible. The pattern of my shifts guarding Cell 12 quickly established a rhythm that was unlike any military duty I had experienced during my 8 years of service, involving not just the physical security protocols and monitoring requirements that characterized conventional guard assignments, but also hours of telepathic communication with the observer that gradually expanded my understanding of human history, cosmic context, and the reality of extraterrestrial involvement in Earth's biological and civilizational development. Each 8-hour shift began with standard security procedures, verification of containment system integrity, review of monitoring logs from previous guards, and systematic checks of the sophisticated sensors that tracked everything from atmospheric conditions to quantum-level energy fluctuations within the cell. But these routine tasks quickly gave way to conversations that ranged across thousands of years of history and challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of human civilization and our place in a universe far more complex and populated than I had ever imagined. My species, the observer explained during my third shift, the telepathic communication now feeling almost natural despite the impossible nature of receiving information directly into my consciousness, began monitoring Earth approximately 12,000 years ago during what your archaeologists call the end of the last ice age, when human populations were transitioning from purely hunter-gatherer societies to early agricultural communities that would eventually develop into the first civilizations. The time frame that the observer described immediately challenged my understanding of human history, which according to conventional academic teaching placed the earliest civilizations around 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia and Egypt, with human cultural development before that period consisting of primitive tribal societies that left minimal archaeological evidence of sophisticated organization or technological capabilities. The transition period between 12,000 and 10,000 years ago, the being continued, the mental transmission including what felt like compressed sensory data that conveyed images of landscapes, human settlements, and environmental conditions that my mind somehow translated into coherent understanding, despite the impossibility of receiving such complex information through non-verbal channels, represented a critical moment in your species' development when several factors converged to make intervention by observer species both necessary and potentially beneficial for long-term civilizational stability. The observer gestured in a way that seemed designed to emphasize the importance of what it was explaining. Rising sea levels from melting ice sheets destroyed coastal settlements that had accumulated thousands of years of technological and cultural development, creating what you now interpret as flood myths present in virtually every human cultural tradition. The survivors of these catastrophes possessed advanced knowledge that had been developed over many generations, but lacked the population density and resource access necessary to maintain the full technological capabilities their ancestors had achieved. The suggestion that human civilization had experienced a major setback approximately 10,000 years ago, losing advanced capabilities that had been developed during previous periods, contradicted everything I had learned about the steady progression of human development from primitive origins to modern technological society. "You're saying," I asked, trying to reconcile the observer's claims with conventional historical understanding, that humans had developed advanced civilizations before the end of the Ice Age, and that these were destroyed by environmental catastrophes, creating the flood myths that appear in cultures around the world. The observer's response came with what I was beginning to recognize as approval for questions that indicated I was processing the information critically, rather than accepting it passively. "The civilization that existed during what you call the last glacial maximum," the being explained, "possessed technological capabilities that included advanced architecture, astronomical knowledge, and engineering techniques that your modern archaeologists struggle to explain when they encounter remnants of that period. The structures at Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, the precise astronomical alignments of monuments across multiple continents, and the sophisticated mathematical knowledge encoded in ancient texts that supposedly originated from primitive cultures. All of these represent surviving fragments of knowledge from civilizations that were far more advanced than conventional historical models acknowledge. The mental communication included what felt like direct sensory experiences of visiting these ancient sites and observing construction techniques and cultural practices that predated recorded history by thousands of years. My skepticism about these claims was natural and professionally appropriate. Accepting that extraterrestrial beings had been monitoring Earth for 12,000 years, and that human civilization had achieved advanced capabilities that were subsequently lost, required evidence beyond telepathic communication from a being whose credibility I had no way to verify independently. "I understand your hesitation to accept these claims without verification," the observer responded, clearly perceiving my doubts through whatever telepathic connection allowed it to access my thoughts and emotional states. "Your military training has taught you to require evidence and to maintain skepticism about information that cannot be independently confirmed through reliable sources. Allow me to demonstrate the accuracy of my species' historical observations by sharing information about specific events that are not recorded in any human historical documents or archaeological evidence that your civilization has access to." The being's golden eyes seemed to intensify their focus, and I felt the telepathic connection deepen in a way that suggested the observer was preparing to transmit more complex information than our previous communications had involved. "I will describe 3 specific events from human history that occurred in locations and time periods that left no surviving written records, but which can be verified through recent archaeological discoveries that your government's intelligence agencies have documented but not yet released to academic or public knowledge." The first event that the observer described involved a catastrophic earthquake that had destroyed a coastal settlement in what is now the Mediterranean region approximately 3,600 years ago, causing massive loss of life and the complete abandonment of a trading network that had connected civilizations across multiple continents. "The settlement," the being explained. "The telepathic transmission including vivid sensory impressions of buildings, harbor facilities, and cultural artifacts that seemed impossibly detailed for events that had occurred more than 3 millennia ago, was located on an island that your modern maps no longer show because the earthquake caused the land to subside below sea level, leaving no visible evidence of the civilization that once thrived there." The observer provided specific coordinates, descriptions of architectural features, and details about artifacts that would be found in the submerged ruins, including a temple complex that contained astronomical instruments designed to track planetary movements with precision that exceeded the supposed capabilities of Bronze Age civilizations. "Your government's naval research vessels discovered this site 7 years ago during classified surveys of underwater anomalies in the Mediterranean," the being continued. "But the findings were deemed too disruptive to conventional historical narratives to be released through normal academic channels. The site contains evidence of technological sophistication and international trade networks that challenge fundamental assumptions about the capabilities and organization of civilizations during that period." The claim that classified government research had discovered underwater ruins matching the observer's description was something I could potentially verify through my security clearances, though accessing classified archaeological findings would require explanations about why a security guard at Area 51 was requesting information about Mediterranean underwater research. "The second event," the observer continued before I could formulate questions about verification procedures, "involved the collapse of a major civilization in what is now the Amazon basin, approximately 200 years ago, when a combination of prolonged drought and social upheaval caused the abandonment of urban centers that housed populations numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The mental transmission included images of sophisticated cities with advanced water management systems, agricultural techniques that modified soil composition to increase fertility, and social organization that integrated multiple ethnic groups into a cohesive political structure that controlled territory spanning thousands of square miles. The conventional academic understanding of pre-Columbian Amazon cultures," the being explained, "assumes that the dense rainforest environment prevented the development of large-scale civilizations because tropical soils cannot support intensive agriculture. However, the civilization I observed had developed terra preta soil modification techniques that overcame these environmental limitations, creating agricultural productivity that supported urban populations that exceeded anything your archaeologists currently believe was possible in that region. The observer provided specific geographic coordinates and descriptions of soil characteristics, pottery styles, and architectural features that would identify the sites of these lost cities, adding that satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted by research teams in the past decade had documented extensive urban structures beneath the rainforest canopy, but that the findings had not been fully published due to their disruptive implications for understanding of pre-Columbian American civilizations. The third event that the observer described was the most recent and therefore potentially the easiest to verify through existing documentation and living witnesses, involving a secret meeting between representatives of multiple world governments in 1954 that had established protocols for managing information about extraterrestrial contact and coordinating responses to non-human intelligence. The meeting, the being explained, occurred at a location that your government officially denies exists, involving participants who included President Eisenhower, military officials from the United States, Soviet Union, United Kingdom, and 3 other nations, and representatives of 2 different extraterrestrial species, including members of my own kind. The telepathic transmission included detailed descriptions of the meeting location, the specific individuals who had attended, and the substance of discussions about how Earth's governments would respond to increasing extraterrestrial presence, and whether humanity should be informed about the reality of non-human intelligence visiting the planet. The decision reached during that meeting, the observer continued, established the framework for government secrecy about extraterrestrial contact that continues to operate today, creating the classification systems and compartmentalized information structures that allow your presence in this facility, while keeping the vast majority of humanity unaware that beings like myself exist and have been interacting with your civilization for thousands of years. The specificity of the observer's description, including names of participants who were still alive, and details about agreements that would be documented in classified archives I theoretically had access to through my security clearances, provided the kind of verifiable information that could test the being's credibility and the accuracy of its claimed historical knowledge. My attempts to verify the observer's claims about classified archaeological discoveries and secret governmental meetings occupied much of my time between shifts, requiring careful use of my security credentials to access databases and communication channels without triggering monitoring systems that would alert my superiors to my unauthorized research. The underwater Mediterranean ruins that the observer had described were indeed documented in classified naval research files, with discoveries that matched the being's description of architectural features, astronomical instruments, and evidence of Bronze Age technological sophistication that exceeded conventional academic understanding of that period's capabilities. The Amazon basin civilizations were similarly documented in recent satellite imagery analysis and ground-penetrating radar surveys that had revealed extensive urban structures, sophisticated agricultural systems, and population densities that contradicted established models of pre-Columbian American development. Most significantly, I discovered references to the 1954 meeting in classification files that confirmed the observer's description of participants, location, and the establishment of international protocols for managing information about extraterrestrial contact. The verification of these specific claims, each involving information that should have been impossible for the being to know unless it had actually observed the events or had access to classified intelligence that exceeded anything available, even to most government officials, forced me to accept that the observer's knowledge of human history was genuine and that its claims about monitoring Earth for thousands of years were likely accurate, despite their revolutionary implications for understanding human civilization. The broader historical context that the observer provided, once I had verified its credibility through the specific examples, revealed a picture of human development that was far more complex and far more influenced by extraterrestrial observation and occasional intervention than conventional historical models acknowledged. My species and several others, the being explained during subsequent shifts, have maintained continuous monitoring of Earth's biological and civilizational development for approximately 12,000 years, with less intensive observation extending back more than 50,000 years to the period when your species first began displaying the kind of abstract thinking, symbolic communication, and social organization that indicated potential for eventually developing technological civilization. The observer described a network of monitoring stations that had been established at various locations around Earth, some in orbit and others in remote geographical areas, that tracked human population movements, technological development, social organization, and environmental impacts using methods that were completely undetectable by human sensory capabilities or technological instruments. The purpose of this monitoring, the being continued, involves multiple objectives that serve both scientific curiosity about biological and civilizational development processes and strategic assessment of whether your species will develop characteristics that would allow productive integration into larger cosmic communities of intelligent civilizations, or whether you will follow developmental paths that would require intervention to prevent damage to yourselves or to the broader interstellar environment. The revelation that humanity was being evaluated according to criteria that would determine our potential integration into some kind of galactic civilization raised obvious questions about what standards were being applied, who made the ultimate decisions about Earth's status, and what forms of intervention might be implemented if humanity was judged to be developing in unacceptable directions. The evaluation criteria, the observer explained, perceiving my questions before I could fully formulate them into coherent inquiries, involve assessment of technological maturity, social organization stability, environmental stewardship, and perhaps most importantly, the development of moral and philosophical frameworks that can guide the use of advanced capabilities in ways that don't threaten other civilizations or cosmic stability. The being's tone through the telepathic connection carried what seemed to be genuine concern about humanity's current trajectory. Your species has developed technological capabilities that include nuclear weapons, genetic manipulation, and artificial intelligence without corresponding development of moral frameworks or social organization structures that can reliably prevent these capabilities from being used in ways that would cause catastrophic harm. The tension between your technological advancement and your moral development represents one of the critical factors being evaluated by those who monitor Earth and make decisions about intervention strategies. The implication that humanity's future might be determined by extraterrestrial observers applying criteria we didn't fully understand created both anxiety about our lack of control over our own destiny and hope that beings with greater wisdom and longer perspectives might help guide us toward better outcomes than we seemed capable of achieving through our own limited understanding and fractured political systems. As my fourth week of shifts guarding Cell 12 concluded, my understanding of human history, cosmic context, and the reality of extraterrestrial involvement in Earth's development had been fundamentally transformed by the information the observer had shared and the verification I had been able to obtain through classified government sources. The being had proven beyond reasonable doubt that it possessed accurate knowledge about human historical events spanning thousands of years, that its species had indeed been monitoring Earth throughout the development of human civilization, and that governments had been aware of extraterrestrial presence and had established protocols for managing this information while keeping the majority of humanity unaware of the reality of non-human intelligence visiting and observing our planet. "You have processed this information well," the observer commented during my final shift of the month, the telepathic communication carrying what I interpreted as approval mixed with what might have been satisfaction at having found a human capable of integrating revolutionary concepts without experiencing the psychological breakdown that had affected previous guards. "Your willingness to verify claims independently while remaining open to possibilities that challenge conventional understanding demonstrates the kind of balanced thinking that will be necessary for what I must share next." The being's golden eyes held steady contact with mine as it prepared to transition from general historical context to the specific revelation that would challenge my Christian faith and require me to reconsider fundamental beliefs about Jesus, divine revelation, and the nature of religious truth. "Now that you understand that my species has observed human civilization throughout its development, and that we possess accurate knowledge of events that humans consider historical facts, myths, or religious revelations, you are ready to hear the truth about the individual you call Jesus Christ, the reality of his mission, and the cosmic significance of the message he brought to humanity 2,000 years ago. The moment when the observer finally prepared to reveal the truth about Jesus Christ felt weighted with significance that exceeded anything we had discussed during our previous weeks of communication, as if the being understood that what it was about to share would challenge the core of my identity in ways that historical revelations about ancient civilizations or government conspiracies could never approach. Sergeant Thompson, the observer began, the telepathic communication carrying undertones of what seemed to be both compassion and resolve. You have identified as a Christian throughout your life, accepting on faith that Jesus of Nazareth was the divine Son of God, who came to earth to redeem humanity from sin through his sacrificial death and resurrection. This belief has provided meaning, moral guidance, and hope for eternal life that has shaped your decisions, your relationships, and your understanding of your purpose in the universe. The being's golden eyes held steady contact with mine, and I could feel through our mental connection that it was carefully assessing my psychological state and readiness to receive information that would require complete restructuring of beliefs I had held since childhood. "What I am about to tell you," it continued, "will not destroy the truth of Jesus' message or diminish the significance of his mission, but it will require you to understand that message and that mission within a cosmic context far larger than traditional Christian theology acknowledges." I felt my hands gripping the edge of my observation station, unconsciously bracing myself for a revelation I both needed to hear and desperately wanted to avoid. The observer's explanation began not with Jesus himself, but with the context of why such a mission had been necessary from the perspective of the extraterrestrial civilizations that had been monitoring Earth's development. Approximately 2,000 years ago, the being explained, the telepathic transmission, including compressed historical data that conveyed the state of human civilization during the Roman period, your species had developed to a point where you possessed the cognitive capabilities for abstract moral reasoning, philosophical thinking, and social organization at scales that exceeded tribal structures, but you had not yet developed ethical frameworks that could guide these capabilities toward outcomes that would ensure long-term survival and eventual integration into larger cosmic communities. The mental communication included what felt like sensory impressions of observing human societies during that period, the brutality of Roman conquest, the proliferation of religious systems that encouraged violence against outsiders, the treatment of women and children as property, and the general acceptance of slavery, torture, and warfare as normal aspects of human civilization. The trajectory you were following, the observer continued, suggested that you would develop increasingly sophisticated technologies and social organization capabilities without corresponding development of moral constraints that could prevent those capabilities from being used in ways that would cause catastrophic harm to yourselves and potentially to others in the cosmic community. The decision to intervene through what the observer described as an educational mission had apparently involved extensive debate among the civilizations that monitored Earth, with some arguing that human development should be allowed to proceed without interference regardless of the potential consequences, while others maintained that the cosmic community had both the capability and the moral obligation to provide guidance that might help humanity develop in more constructive directions. "The individual you call Jesus," the observer stated, the telepathic communication shifting to include what seemed to be direct sensory memories rather than abstract information, was one of our kind, a member of my species who volunteered for a mission that required him to be born into human society, to grow up experiencing human limitations and suffering, and to introduce moral and philosophical teachings that could accelerate your development toward ethical frameworks capable of guiding the use of advanced capabilities. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow, creating immediate resistance from every part of my Christian faith that had been built on the foundation of Jesus' divinity and unique status as the Son of God. "I know this contradicts what you have believed," the observer continued, clearly perceiving my emotional turmoil through our telepathic connection. "But I need you to understand that what I am describing does not diminish the truth or significance of Jesus' message. It contextualizes that message within a reality that is larger and more complex than traditional theology acknowledges." My first response was immediate and visceral rejection of what the observer was claiming, driven by decades of Christian teaching and personal faith that had been central to my identity since childhood. "No," I said aloud, my voice carrying anger and fear that I made no attempt to conceal. Jesus was the Son of God, born of a virgin, performing miracles through divine power, dying for our sins and rising from the dead to offer salvation to all who believe. What you're describing it's blasphemy. It's a lie designed to undermine faith and turn people away from God. Even as I spoke, I could feel the observer's patient presence in my mind, waiting for my initial emotional reaction to subside so that we could engage with the information on a more rational level. Your reaction is understandable, the being responded, the telepathic communication carrying no judgment or condescension, and I do not ask you to abandon your faith or reject the truth of Jesus' teachings. What I ask is that you consider the possibility that divine truth can manifest through means that human theology has not yet fully understood, and that beings with capabilities that appear miraculous to less advanced civilizations can serve purposes that are genuinely sacred, even if the mechanisms through which they operate exceed human comprehension. The observer's offer to provide evidence for its claims about Jesus' true nature forced me to make a choice between retreating into the comfort of unquestioned faith or applying the same critical thinking and verification standards I had used to evaluate the being's other historical revelations. I was present, the observer stated, the mental communication now including what felt like direct memories rather than second-hand information. During the period you call Jesus' ministry, observing his teachings, witnessing what humans interpreted as miracles, and understanding the true nature of the mission he had undertaken, the being's golden eyes seemed to glow more intensely. I can share with you my direct observations of specific events that are recorded in your Gospels, providing details that were not included in the biblical accounts but which can help you understand what actually occurred and how those events were accomplished through methods that combined advanced biological capabilities with technologies that would appear miraculous to first-century humans. The offer to receive eyewitness testimony about events that were central to Christian faith created intense conflict between my desire to know the truth and my fear that such knowledge would destroy beliefs that had provided meaning and hope throughout my life. "Show me," I finally said, making the same decision I had made weeks earlier to prioritize truth over comfortable certainty. But understand that I won't accept claims without evidence, and that I'll be evaluating everything you share against what I know from Scripture and from my faith. The first memory that the observer shared involved what Christians know as the virgin birth, and the being's direct sensory impressions of those events provided context that was simultaneously more amazing and more scientifically explicable than the traditional miraculous conception described in gospel accounts. "The woman you call Mary," the observer explained, the telepathic transmission including visual and sensory impressions of a young woman in first-century Judea, was selected through careful observation of genetic lines and psychological profiles that indicated she could produce offspring with optimal characteristics for the educational mission we had planned. The mental communication included images of what appeared to be medical procedures being performed while Mary was in an unconscious or altered state of consciousness, using technologies that combined biological manipulation with energy-based techniques that modified genetic structures and implanted fertilized cells that had been engineered to produce specific capabilities. What she experienced and remembered as angelic visitation, the being continued, was contact with members of my species who explained the significance of what was occurring and prepared her psychologically for raising a child who would possess capabilities that exceeded normal human limitations. The observer's description didn't deny the miraculous nature of Jesus' conception, but it reframed that miracle as the result of advanced biological engineering rather than direct divine intervention that suspended natural laws, and it suggested that Mary had been a willing participant in a plan that had cosmic significance, even if she didn't fully understand the technological mechanisms through which it was being accomplished. The memories that the observer shared of Jesus' childhood and early development painted a picture of an individual who was simultaneously fully human in his physical form and biological needs, but whose genetic structure had been enhanced to provide capabilities that exceeded normal human limitations in ways that would enable his teaching mission while appearing miraculous to those who witnessed his actions. The enhancements, the observer explained, included accelerated healing abilities that could be extended to others through bioelectric field manipulation, enhanced cognitive processing that allowed for advanced moral reasoning and teaching capabilities, and electromagnetic influence over biological and physical systems that could produce effects that humans interpreted as supernatural power over nature and matter. The telepathic transmission included sensory impressions of observing a young Jesus, learning to understand and control these enhanced capabilities under guidance from teachers who appeared to him as spiritual mentors, but who were actually members of the observer's species, providing technical training disguised as religious education. The period described in your Gospels as Jesus' time in the wilderness being tempted by Satan, the being shared, was actually an intensive training period during which he learned to fully utilize his enhanced capabilities while resisting the temptation to use those powers for personal benefit rather than for the teaching mission he had been prepared to undertake. The reframing of familiar biblical narratives within a context of advanced biological engineering and educational preparation challenged my traditional understanding, while simultaneously making aspects of Jesus' story more comprehensible than the purely supernatural explanations I had been taught. The observer's memories of Jesus' ministry and the events that Christians know as miracles provided detailed explanations of how each seemingly supernatural act had been accomplished through combination of enhanced biological capabilities and technologies that were invisible to first-century observers, but which produced effects that appeared to violate natural laws. The healings, the being explained, sharing sensory impressions of witnessing Jesus curing leprosy, restoring sight to the blind, and enabling the paralyzed to walk, were accomplished through bioelectric field manipulation that could stimulate cellular regeneration, repair neural damage, and restore normal biological function to tissues and organs that had been compromised by disease or injury. The mental communication included technical details about frequency patterns, energy transfer mechanisms, and biological response systems that were far beyond my ability to fully comprehend, but which made it clear that the healings were genuine restoration of health rather than tricks or psychological manipulation, even if the mechanisms differed from the divine power described in traditional theological explanations. The multiplication of food, the observer continued, describing the feeding of thousands with limited resources, involved matter replication technology that could analyze molecular structures and reproduce them using energy-to-matter conversion processes that your physics is only beginning to understand theoretically, but which my species has employed practically for millions of years. Each miracle was explained not as a suspension of natural law, but as the application of advanced capabilities that operated according to physical principles that human science had not yet discovered or fully developed. The crucifixion and resurrection events that form the central narrative of Christian salvation theology were the most challenging aspects of the observer's testimony, requiring me to reconcile what I had believed about Jesus' sacrificial death for human sin with the being's explanation of what had actually occurred and why those events had unfolded as they did. The crucifixion, the observer shared, the telepathic transmission carrying what seemed to be genuine sorrow about events it had witnessed 2,000 years earlier, was genuine suffering and genuine death. The enhanced biological capabilities that Jesus possessed did not prevent him from experiencing the full physical and emotional trauma that crucifixion inflicted on human bodies. The being's memories included sensory impressions of observing the crucifixion, with full awareness of the pain being experienced, while being unable to intervene without compromising the mission that required Jesus to demonstrate complete commitment to his teaching even at the cost of his own life. The death was real, the observer emphasized, but the resurrection was accomplished through medical intervention that your gospel writers could only describe as miraculous because they lacked any framework for understanding advanced biological restoration technologies. The mental communication included images of what appeared to be a recovery facility, where Jesus' body had been taken after death had been confirmed, where technologies that combined energy-based cellular regeneration with biological repair systems had restored life and healed the trauma that crucifixion had inflicted, producing a genuine return from death that was both miraculous in its outcome and technological in its methodology. The purpose and significance of Jesus' mission, according to the observer's explanation, involved not the payment of divine blood debt for human sin as traditional Christian theology taught, but rather the introduction of moral and philosophical teachings that could guide humanity toward ethical frameworks capable of supporting the development of advanced technological civilization without catastrophic misuse of those capabilities. The message that Jesus brought, the being explained, emphasized love, compassion, forgiveness, and service to others as fundamental principles that should guide human behavior and social organization. These teachings were not arbitrary moral rules imposed by divine authority, but rather practical guidelines that civilizations throughout the cosmos have discovered are necessary for stable development of societies that possess advanced capabilities. The observer's golden eyes held steady contact with mine as it continued. The significance of Jesus' mission was not that his death somehow satisfied divine justice requirements, but that his teachings and his example of commitment to moral truth even unto death provided humanity with a foundation for ethical development that could enable you to eventually join the larger community of conscious civilizations that populate the universe. The reframing of salvation from individual redemption from sin to collective elevation toward ethical maturity required complete restructuring of my theological understanding. But it also suggested that Jesus' message was even more universally significant than I had believed, with implications that extended beyond Earth to encompass cosmic moral truth. As the observer concluded its initial revelations about Jesus' true nature and mission, I found myself experiencing emotional turmoil that combined grief at the loss of comfortable certainties with awe at the possibility that the truth was far more magnificent than what I had been taught to believe. I know this challenges everything you have believed about salvation, about Jesus' divinity, and about the nature of God, the being communicated, its telepathic presence carrying genuine compassion for the psychological struggle I was experiencing. But consider the possibility that divine truth is larger than human theology has been able to comprehend, that God, or the cosmic intelligence that created and sustains the universe, works through means that include advanced civilizations guiding less developed species toward moral and spiritual maturity, and that Jesus' mission was genuinely sacred, even if the mechanisms through which it was accomplished differed from traditional understanding. The observer paused, allowing me time to process before continuing. The message Jesus brought about love, forgiveness, and the inherent worth of all conscious beings remains true, regardless of whether he was the literal Son of God or an advanced being on an educational mission. The choice to live according to those principles, to treat others with compassion, and to pursue moral development as a path toward transcendence, these remain valid whether your theology is completely accurate or whether it represents humanity's best attempt to understand truths that exceed your current conceptual frameworks. As my shift ended and I prepared to leave Cell 12 for my mandatory rest period, I realized that my faith had not been destroyed, but rather transformed into something larger and more complex than what I had carried into this facility, and that the observer had not taken away my belief in Jesus, but had instead revealed that the reality of who Jesus was and what he accomplished might be even more amazing than the miracle I had been taught to accept on faith alone. The observer's offer to show me actual visual records of the events I had known only through biblical texts and faith-based teaching represented a threshold moment that would either confirm everything the being had told me or reveal it as an elaborate deception designed to undermine my beliefs. The technology in this cell, the observer explained, gesturing toward walls that I had assumed were simple containment barriers, includes recording and display systems that your government's scientists don't fully understand, but which we use to maintain archival documentation of significant events we observe during our monitoring operations. The being's golden eyes held my gaze with intensity that suggested it understood the magnitude of what it was offering. I can project three-dimensional holographic reconstructions of actual events from 2,000 years ago, showing you what I witnessed with the same clarity and detail as if you were standing beside me during Jesus' ministry. My hands were shaking as I nodded consent, knowing that what I was about to see would either validate the observer's revolutionary claims or demonstrate that I had been manipulated by sophisticated illusions designed to exploit my need for answers about faith and cosmic truth. The walls of Cell 12 seemed to dissolve as the holographic projection activated, replacing the sterile containment facility with a vivid reconstruction of a small dwelling in what the observer identified as first-century Nazareth. The level of detail was extraordinary. I could see the texture of mud brick walls, the weaving patterns in fabric hanging in doorways, even the individual grains in wooden beams that supported the roof. "This is not a simulation or artistic interpretation," the observer explained, its telepathic voice continuing even as the hologram showed scenes from 2 millennia past. "What you are seeing is a precise reconstruction from archived sensory data collected during direct observation of these events. The projection showed a young woman, Mary, in what appeared to be an ordinary domestic setting, but as I watched, the scene shifted to show her encountering beings that appeared similar to the observer, their presence accompanied by what looked like scanning equipment that was invisible to Mary but which showed up in the holographic reconstruction as faint energy fields surrounding her body. The conception event that the observer's hologram displayed was simultaneously more clinical and more reverent than I had imagined, showing Mary in what appeared to be a state of peaceful unconsciousness while advanced medical procedures were performed using technologies that combined visible instrumentation with energy-based systems that left no physical marks. She was not harmed or violated, the observer emphasized, clearly sensing my discomfort at witnessing what felt like a deeply private moment. The procedure was conducted with the same care and respect that your best medical facilities would provide, but using capabilities that ensured the genetic modifications were precise and that Mary would carry the pregnancy without complications that might have occurred in normal circumstances. The hologram showed cellular-level imagery of the fertilized egg being implanted, with genetic structures that glowed in ways that indicated they had been enhanced beyond normal human DNA patterns. The enhancements, the being explained, provided Jesus with capabilities that were still fundamentally biological and subject to physical laws, but which operated at efficiency levels and with control mechanisms that exceeded anything possible through natural human genetics. The transition to scenes from Jesus' childhood and early ministry showed the development of someone who was simultaneously completely human in his emotional and social experiences, but whose enhanced capabilities became increasingly apparent as he learned to understand and control them. The hologram displayed a young Jesus accidentally healing a childhood friend's injury through instinctive bioelectric response, the surprise and confusion on both children's faces, making it clear that this was not a consciously controlled miracle, but rather an emergent capability that he didn't yet understand. The training period, the observer shared, projecting scenes of Jesus in isolation being taught by beings that appeared to him as angels or spiritual guides, involved helping him understand the nature of his enhancements, teaching him to control the bioelectric and molecular manipulation capabilities he possessed, and preparing him for a teaching mission that would require him to use these abilities in ways that would inspire faith while advancing moral development. The holographic instructors demonstrated techniques for focusing intention and energy to produce healing effects, showing Jesus practicing on injured animals and sick individuals, while learning to modulate the intensity and specificity of his bioelectric field projections. The first miracle that the observer showed me in full holographic detail was the healing of a leper, an event described briefly in the Gospels, but which the projection revealed in extraordinary clarity that made the reality of both the disease and the cure undeniable. The hologram showed Jesus approaching a man whose body was ravaged by advanced leprosy, the tissue damage and infection visible in grotesque detail that made me understand why biblical accounts emphasized that lepers were isolated from normal society. Watch carefully, the observer instructed, and you will see that the healing is genuine biological restoration, not illusion or temporary symptom relief. The projection showed Jesus placing his hands on the diseased flesh, and I could see, displayed in false color overlay that made energy patterns visible, bioelectric fields emanating from Jesus' hands and penetrating into the leper's body. The cellular response was immediate and dramatic, with damaged tissue beginning to regenerate at rates that should have required weeks or months, but which occurred in minutes as the bioelectric stimulation activated healing processes that exceeded normal human capabilities. The energy transfer, the observer explained, stimulated the man's own cellular repair mechanisms while providing the biological resources necessary for rapid regeneration, producing complete healing that was permanent and genuine rather than temporary or cosmetic. The multiplication of food that Christians know as the feeding of the 5,000 was displayed in holographic detail that revealed technologies so advanced they appeared almost magical despite the observer's scientific explanations. The projection showed Jesus with a small amount of bread and fish, surrounded by thousands of hungry people. And as I watched, I could see, again displayed in false color overlay, molecular-level scanning of the food's composition, followed by energy-based replication that created identical copies with such precision that they were indistinguishable from the original. The technology, the observer explained, converts energy directly into matter using templates derived from scanning existing objects, producing replicas that are molecularly identical to the source material. The hologram showed baskets being filled with replicated bread and fish, the food being distributed to crowds who had no awareness that they were witnessing technology that exceeded human capabilities by thousands of years. To the observers, the being continued, this appeared to be divine multiplication of resources through supernatural power, but the reality was application of matter-energy conversion principles that your physics is only beginning to understand theoretically. The crucifixion scene that the observer's hologram displayed was the most difficult to witness, showing in brutal clarity the physical trauma that Roman execution methods inflicted on human bodies and the genuine suffering that Jesus experienced during the final hours of his life. The projection didn't spare any details. I could see the tissue damage from scourging, the shock and blood loss from crucifixion, and the progressive physiological shutdown as Jesus's enhanced biology fought and ultimately succumbed to trauma that exceeded even his advanced healing capabilities. His enhancements, the observer explained as I struggled to watch the suffering being displayed before me, allowed him to maintain consciousness and mental clarity far longer than normal humans could endure under such conditions, which meant he experienced the full reality of crucifixion without the mercy of early unconsciousness that typically reduced suffering for ordinary victims. The hologram showed Jesus's final moments with such detail that I could see the exact instant when his enhanced biological systems finally ceased to maintain life, confirming that the death was genuine and complete, rather than some form of suspended animation or trick. He died, the observer stated with finality. The resurrection that followed was not spontaneous divine miracle, but rather technological intervention that became possible only after death had been confirmed and the body could be moved to a recovery facility. The resurrection event that the hologram displayed occurred in a location that looked nothing like the tomb described in gospel accounts, but rather appeared to be a sophisticated medical facility that had been concealed in cave systems near Jerusalem. The projection showed Jesus' body being transported by beings similar to the observer, using what appeared to be anti-gravity technology to move him without physical contact that might cause additional damage to traumatized tissues. The recovery process, the being explained, required 48 hours of intensive cellular regeneration using technologies that combined bioelectric field stimulation with molecular repair systems and energy infusions that gradually restored biological function to tissues that had been compromised by trauma and death. The hologram showed in extraordinary detail the process of cells being repaired, neural networks being restored, and organ systems being brought back to functional status through application of technologies that made modern human medical capabilities look primitive by comparison. The result, the observer continued, was genuine resurrection from genuine death, producing a living being who had experienced the full reality of crucifixion and death, but who had been restored through technological intervention that Jesus' followers could only understand as miraculous divine power. The post-resurrection appearances that the hologram displayed showed Jesus interacting with his disciples while bearing the physical marks of crucifixion, but demonstrating restored health and capabilities that exceeded his pre-death condition. The resurrection process, the observer explained, not only restored his previous biological function, but also enhanced certain capabilities that would allow him to complete his teaching mission before the final phase of our intervention plan. The projection showed Jesus demonstrating abilities that included appearing and disappearing from locked rooms, which the observer explained as controlled manipulation of visibility through light-bending technology rather than actual teleportation, and consuming food to prove his physical reality, while also displaying enhanced control over biological processes that normal humans lacked. The 40 days described in your biblical accounts, the being shared, were used for final teachings to his closest followers and for preparing them to continue spreading his message after his departure, which your tradition calls the ascension, but which was actually his return to our facilities using transportation technology that appeared to witnesses as miraculous rising into the sky. The final holographic projection that the observer showed me displayed the ascension event from a perspective that revealed both what Jesus' disciples had witnessed and what had actually occurred using technologies that remained invisible to first-century observers. The projection showed Jesus on a hillside with his followers, his body beginning to rise into the air in ways that defied normal gravity, while the hologram's technical overlay revealed the operation of anti-gravity field generators that were positioned around the area but which were imperceptible to human senses. To the witnesses, the observer explained, this appeared to be Jesus ascending to heaven through divine power, and that interpretation served the purpose of inspiring faith and confirming his divine authority in ways that supported the spread of his teachings. The projection showed Jesus' ascent continuing until he disappeared from normal visual range, at which point the hologram revealed a ship that had been concealed using technology that prevented it from being detected by human sensory capabilities. The ship, the being shared, transported him to orbital facilities where he could transition back to his normal form and prepare reports on the mission's outcomes and the likelihood that his teachings would produce the desired effects on human moral development. The casual way the observer described Jesus writing mission reports while recovering from crucifixion and resurrection created surreal cognitive dissonance with traditional Christian theology, but the holographic evidence I had witnessed made it impossible to dismiss the being's account as fantasy or deception. As the holographic projections concluded and the walls of Cell 12 returned to their normal appearance, I found myself in a state of emotional and intellectual overwhelm that exceeded anything I had experienced during combat deployments or previous life challenges. I had witnessed with my own eyes evidence that Jesus had been real, that his miracles had been genuine, that his death and resurrection had occurred as described in biblical accounts. But I had also seen that the mechanisms through which these events had been accomplished involved advanced technology rather than supernatural divine power, and that Jesus himself had been an enhanced biological being on an educational mission rather than the literal Son of God incarnated through miraculous means. I understand, the observer communicated, its telepathic presence gentle and patient as I processed the implications of what I had seen, that reconciling the evidence with your existing faith requires time and emotional work that cannot be rushed. But I want you to consider whether the truth I have shown you diminishes Jesus' significance or actually magnifies it by revealing that his mission was part of a cosmic plan that extends far beyond Earth and encompasses the moral development of consciousness throughout the universe. The being's golden eyes held steady compassion as it continued. The choice to undergo crucifixion, the commitment to his teaching mission despite knowing it would result in his death, and the love he demonstrated for humanity. These remain true and remain sacred regardless of whether he was divine in the traditional theological sense or was an advanced being who sacrificed himself to help your species develop the moral frameworks necessary for survival and eventual cosmic integration. As my shift ended and I prepared to leave the cell, I knew that I could never return to the simple certainties of my previous faith, but I also knew that the truth the observer had revealed was somehow larger and more magnificent than what I had believed before, and that my mission now involved not just guarding an alien prisoner, but understanding and perhaps eventually sharing revelations that would transform human understanding of religion, history, and our place in a universe far more complex and purposeful than we had ever imagined. The days following my exposure to the holographic evidence of Jesus' true nature were filled with psychological turmoil as I attempted to reconcile what I had witnessed with everything I had believed about faith, divine purpose, and the nature of religious truth. The observer had given me time to process the visual evidence before continuing our conversations, apparently understanding that forcing additional revelations onto someone whose worldview had just been fundamentally shattered would risk the kind of psychological breakdown that had affected previous guards. When I finally returned to Cell 12 after my mandatory rest period, the being greeted me with what I had learned to recognize as concern mixed with determination to complete the mission of sharing information that would prepare me for truths even more revolutionary than what I had already learned. Sergeant Thompson, the observer communicated telepathically, you have processed the evidence about Jesus' mission with remarkable resilience, and you are ready to understand the larger context within which his work was conducted. A comprehensive program spanning thousands of years that involved not just Christianity but all major religious traditions that have shaped human moral and philosophical development. The observer's explanation of religion as a systematic preparation program for eventual human integration into cosmic civilization began with a historical overview that reframed every major spiritual tradition as part of a coordinated effort to guide human moral evolution toward frameworks compatible with advanced technological capabilities. The challenge facing any developing species, the being explained, the telepathic communication, including conceptual frameworks that conveyed complex sociological and evolutionary dynamics, is that technological capability tends to advance much faster than moral wisdom, creating periods when civilizations possess the power to destroy themselves or cause catastrophic harm to their planetary systems before they have developed ethical constraints adequate to prevent such outcomes. The observer's golden eyes reflected what seemed to be genuine concern about humanity's current trajectory. Your species currently possesses nuclear weapons, genetic manipulation technologies, and artificial intelligence systems that could cause extinction-level catastrophes if used without moral wisdom to guide their application. The religious traditions that we helped establish throughout human history were designed to accelerate the development of ethical frameworks that could eventually provide the wisdom necessary to handle such capabilities responsibly. The revelation that multiple religious traditions, not just Christianity, but also Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, and others, had been influenced or established through extraterrestrial intervention, created a picture of systematic moral guidance that spanned millennia and involved coordinated efforts across different cultures and geographical regions. The commonalities you notice across different religious traditions, the observer explained, are not coincidental or the result of independent human discovery of universal moral truths, though such truths do exist. Rather, they reflect the reality that beings like myself have been providing similar moral and philosophical guidance to different human populations, adapted to their specific cultural contexts, but conveying fundamentally consistent messages about compassion, justice, and the inherent worth of conscious beings. The telepathic transmission included what felt like compressed historical data, showing the emergence of major religious figures throughout human history, Buddha, Muhammad, various Hindu teachers and prophets, and suggesting that many of these individuals had either been members of advanced species on educational missions similar to Jesus' work, or had been human individuals who had received direct guidance from extraterrestrial observers. The goal, the being continued, was not to create uniform religious belief across all human cultures, but rather to establish diverse traditions that could provide moral frameworks appropriate to different social structures, while all advancing humanity toward ethical maturity that would eventually allow integration into larger cosmic communities. The concept that biblical prophecies and other religious predictions were actually encoded timetables for human civilizational development rather than supernatural foreknowledge of future events required complete restructuring of how I understood prophetic literature and divine revelation. The prophecies described in your biblical texts and other religious traditions, the observer explained, were not predictions of predetermined events that would occur regardless of human choices, but rather roadmaps describing developmental milestones that we expected humanity to achieve if our educational interventions were successful. The being projected what appeared to be a timeline showing major biblical prophecies aligned with historical developments in human technology, social organization, and moral understanding. The prophecy of knowledge increasing and people running to and fro, for example, accurately described the development of global transportation and information systems that would characterize the modern era. The prediction of wars and rumors of wars described the period of technological advancement that would precede the final evaluation phase, what your Christian tradition calls the end times, but which is actually the period when humanity approaches readiness for formal contact with the cosmic community. The observer's explanation of the second coming as a literal physical return, rather than a metaphorical or purely spiritual event, was delivered with such matter-of-fact certainty that it took several moments for the full implications to register. The return that Jesus promised, the being stated, was not a vague spiritual occurrence or a symbolic transformation of human consciousness, but rather a planned physical arrival of the same individual who conducted the educational mission 2,000 years ago, now returning to evaluate humanity's progress and determine whether your species has developed the moral maturity necessary for integration into larger cosmic civilization. The telepathic communication carried undertones of significance that made it clear this wasn't abstract theological discussion, but rather information about actual events that were being planned and coordinated by the civilizations monitoring Earth. The mothership that will facilitate this return, the observer continued, is currently positioned beyond your solar system's outer planets, conducting final preparations and monitoring Earth's development to determine optimal timing for the evaluation phase that your religious traditions describe using terms like judgment, tribulation, and transformation. The timeline for this return that the observer shared was both specific enough to create genuine urgency and vague enough to acknowledge that exact timing depended on humanity achieving certain developmental milestones that couldn't be predicted with absolute precision. The current assessment, the being explained, indicates that humanity will reach the necessary threshold of technological and social development within the next 7 to 10 years, triggering the return sequence that will culminate in what your biblical prophecies describe as the second coming. The telepathic transmission included what felt like assessment criteria being evaluated in real time, measures of global connectivity, technological sophistication, social organization complexity, and moral framework development that were being continuously monitored and scored against standards that would determine readiness for contact. The specific markers we are watching, the observer continued, include achievement of sustainable global governance systems that can speak for humanity as a unified civilization, rather than as competing nations. Development of technologies that demonstrate understanding of fundamental physical principles necessary for interstellar communication and eventually travel. And most importantly, evidence of moral frameworks that can prevent catastrophic misuse of advanced capabilities. The being's tone through our telepathic connection carried what seemed to be both hope and concern about humanity's progress toward these milestones. The signs that the observer identified as indicators that the return timeline was approaching its culmination included current events and trends that I could verify through normal observation of global affairs, making the prophecy feel immediately relevant rather than distant future speculation. The acceleration of technological development that you have witnessed during your lifetime, the being explained, with capabilities that seemed like science fiction when you were young becoming routine commercial technologies, represents one of the key markers indicating that humanity approaches the threshold for evaluation. The observer projected data showing the exponential growth curves for computing power, genetic understanding, space exploration capabilities, and artificial intelligence development, all of which showed dramatic acceleration in recent decades. The increasing connectivity of human populations through global communication networks, it continued, creates conditions where unified moral frameworks can potentially develop across cultural boundaries, allowing for the kind of species-level ethical standards that would be necessary for cosmic integration. The being's assessment included both positive indicators, growing human awareness of global challenges requiring cooperative solutions, increasing emphasis on human rights and dignity across diverse cultures, and concerning trends including political fragmentation, religious extremism, and technological arms races that could derail the positive trajectory. The role of current global challenges and crises in the overall timeline was explained not as random suffering or signs of divine judgment, but rather as natural consequences of humanity reaching technological capabilities without corresponding moral development. Exactly the situation that the religious preparation program had been designed to prevent. The environmental degradation, the nuclear proliferation, the development of autonomous weapon systems and unregulated artificial intelligence, the observer listed, all represent manifestations of the fundamental challenge facing your species. You possess the capability to cause catastrophic harm, but have not yet developed the moral and social frameworks necessary to reliably prevent such outcomes. The being's telepathic communication carried what seemed to be genuine concern, rather than judgment. The return timeline has been structured to occur before humanity reaches the point where self-destruction becomes inevitable, providing intervention that can guide you through this critical transition period. But the intervention will only be successful if humanity has developed sufficient moral foundation to receive guidance rather than rejecting it through fear or tribalism. The implication that the return's success depended partially on human readiness suggested that the cosmic observers couldn't simply impose solutions, but rather needed to work with whatever moral and social development humanity had achieved through our own efforts and their subtle guidance over millennia. The observer's description of what would actually occur during the return event combined elements familiar from biblical prophecy with scientific and sociological details that made the process seem simultaneously more amazing and more comprehensible than traditional theological interpretations suggested. The arrival of the mothership, the being explained, will be conducted in ways designed to minimize panic while making clear that humanity is encountering genuinely extraterrestrial intelligence rather than experiencing collective hallucination or supernatural miracle. The telepathic transmission included what felt like simulated scenarios showing massive ships appearing in Earth's skies, conducting coordinated global communication through all major media systems, and initiating contact protocols that had been developed based on thousands of years of studying human psychology and social organization. Jesus will be present during the initial contact, the observer stated with the same matter-of-fact certainty it had used throughout our conversations, serving as a familiar figure who can help bridge the gap between human religious expectations and the reality of cosmic civilization. His presence will allow those with strong Christian faith to interpret the contact within their existing belief frameworks, while also revealing to all humanity that religious traditions were preparation for this moment of joining the larger community of conscious beings. The description suggested careful psychological planning designed to manage humanity's transition from planetary isolation to cosmic awareness, while minimizing the kind of social disruption that could derail the integration process. The evaluation criteria that would determine humanity's fate following the return were described not as arbitrary divine judgment, but rather as systematic assessment of whether our species had developed characteristics that would allow productive participation in cosmic civilization. The assessment, the observer explained, will evaluate humanity's collective moral development, social organization capabilities, technological responsibility, and potential for contributing to rather than threatening the larger community of civilizations. The being projected what appeared to be evaluation matrices showing different possible outcomes ranging from full immediate integration into cosmic civilization to conditional acceptance with continued monitoring and guidance to various forms of intervention if humanity was assessed as not yet ready for contact or as representing potential threat to cosmic stability. The goal is not to judge and condemn, the observer emphasized, but rather to determine what level of support and guidance humanity requires to successfully navigate the transition to being a conscious participant in cosmic affairs rather than an isolated species developing in quarantine. The suggestion that Earth had been maintained in some form of cosmic quarantine pending our development of adequate moral maturity provided context for why extraterrestrial contact had been limited to covert observation rather than open interaction, despite the obvious presence of advanced civilizations capable of traveling to our planet. As the observer concluded its explanation of the divine timeline and the approaching return, I found myself experiencing a strange combination of terror at the magnitude of what was being described and hope that humanity might be approaching a transformation that would resolve many of the seemingly intractable problems we faced. Sergeant Thompson, the being communicated with what felt like genuine respect for the psychological challenges I had faced during our conversations. You now understand that the second coming described in your religious traditions is not metaphorical but literal, not distant but imminent, and not supernatural but rather technological intervention that serves genuinely sacred purposes. The observer's golden eyes held steady compassion as it continued. The question you must now decide is what role you will play in preparing humanity for this contact. Will you remain silent, guarding this knowledge as classified information that serves government interests? Will you share what you have learned, risking your career and freedom to warn humanity that we are being watched and will soon be evaluated? Or will you find some middle path that allows you to influence events while managing the risks that come with revealing truths that challenge both governmental authority and religious certainty? As my shift ended, and I left Cell 12 to process these impossible questions, I realized that the observer had been preparing me not just to understand cosmic truth, but to make choices about how to use that knowledge, and that my decision about what to do with the revelations I had received would determine not just my own fate, but potentially influence how humanity approached the most significant transformation in our species' history. The question that had been burning in my mind since the observer first mentioned the literal return of Jesus finally emerged during my next shift guarding Cell 12. If this event was actually planned and imminent rather than distant future prophecy, when exactly would it occur? The timing, the observer responded to my unspoken question, its telepathic presence suggesting it had been waiting for me to reach the point where I was ready to receive this specific information, is determined by a combination of predetermined schedule markers and adaptive assessment of humanity's actual developmental progress. The being's golden eyes seemed to glow more intensely as it continued. We can provide a window of probability based on current trajectories, but we cannot give you an exact date because the final triggering conditions depend on humanity achieving specific milestones that your species controls through your own choices and actions. The explanation suggested that, while the cosmic observers had planned the general timeline, they were allowing human free will and development to determine the precise moment when contact would be initiated. Based on current assessment of your species' technological advancement, social organization development, and moral framework evolution, the observer stated with clinical precision, the return will occur within a window of 7 to 10 years from your current time period. The specificity of that time frame hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't distant future speculation or vague eventual prophecy, but rather an event scheduled to occur within my lifetime, possibly within the next decade. The variability in that timeline, the being continued, reflects uncertainty about how quickly humanity will achieve the necessary threshold markers that indicate readiness for contact. If your species makes rapid progress in global cooperation, environmental stewardship, and development of moral constraints on advanced technologies, the contact could occur toward the earlier end of that window. If progress is slower, or if significant setbacks occur, the timeline could extend toward the later range or potentially be delayed beyond 10 years if we assess that premature contact would cause more harm than benefit. The specific milestone markers that the observer identified as determining factors for the exact timing included measurable criteria that I could verify through observation of current global trends and developments. The first critical marker, the being explained, projecting data that showed global trends in political organization, is the emergence of effective international governance systems that can speak for humanity as a unified civilization rather than as competing nations. This doesn't require complete political unification or elimination of cultural diversity, but rather development of decision-making frameworks that allow coordinated response to planetary-level challenges and that can negotiate on behalf of the species as a whole. The observer showed projections of current international institutions and their evolution toward greater authority and effectiveness, suggesting that humanity was making progress toward this marker, but had not yet achieved the threshold necessary for cosmic contact. The second marker involves technological achievement that demonstrates understanding of fundamental physical principles necessary for eventual interstellar communication and travel. It continued, displaying data about human space exploration, quantum physics research, and energy generation capabilities. Your recent developments in quantum computing, fusion energy research, and space resource utilization indicate that you are approaching, but have not yet reached the technological threshold that would make meaningful cosmic integration possible. The moral development marker that the observer described as perhaps most critical for determining contact timing involved evidence that humanity could handle advanced capabilities without catastrophic misuse, a criterion that current global conditions suggested we were struggling to meet. The presence of nuclear weapons, the being explained with what seemed to be genuine concern, combined with increasing development of autonomous weapons systems, unregulated genetic modification technologies, and artificial intelligence systems without adequate safety protocols, indicates that your species possesses civilization-ending capabilities without corresponding moral frameworks to ensure responsible use. The observer projected data showing near-miss nuclear incidents, bioweapon research programs, and AI development without ethical oversight that had occurred just in recent years. Each of these near catastrophes represents a test of humanity's moral development. Will you recognize the dangers and implement safeguards? Or will you continue advancing technological capabilities without adequate wisdom to guide their application? The implication was clear that the cosmic observers were watching these specific events as indicators of whether humanity was developing the maturity necessary for contact, or whether we remained too dangerous to ourselves, and potentially others, to be allowed unrestricted access to advanced technologies. The signs that the observer identified as indicators that the return timeline was actively accelerating included recent phenomena that I could verify through news reports, military intelligence, and personal observation. The dramatic increase in UFO sightings and military encounters with unidentified aerial phenomena over the past 5 years, the being explained, is not coincidental, but rather represents deliberate increase in our visible presence as we conduct final assessment activities and begin the psychological preparation phase for open contact. The observer projected data showing the spike in credible UFO reports, official military acknowledgement of encounters with craft displaying impossible flight characteristics, and government disclosure programs that were slowly acclimating the public to the reality of non-human intelligence. These sightings serve multiple purposes, it continued. They provide data about human reaction to unexplained phenomena. They begin to normalize the concept of advanced non-human technology, and they create conditions where official disclosure becomes possible without causing the kind of mass panic that would have occurred if such revelations had been made 50 years ago. The environmental and geopolitical changes that had characterized recent years were explained not as random crises, but as expected consequences of humanity approaching the critical transition point where planetary-level organization would become necessary for survival. The climate disruptions, the mass migrations, the resource competition, and the breakdown of traditional political structures, the observer listed, all represent natural outcomes of a species achieving global-scale technological capabilities without yet possessing global-scale social organization or moral frameworks to manage those capabilities wisely. The being's telepathic communication carried what seemed to be both sympathy for human suffering and clinical observation of expected developmental patterns. These crises serve as forcing functions that push humanity toward the kind of cooperative behavior and unified decision-making that will be necessary for cosmic integration. The question being evaluated is whether you will respond to these challenges by developing more effective cooperation and moral maturity, or whether you will fragment into competing factions fighting over diminishing resources. The implication was that the timing of contact would be influenced by which of these paths humanity followed in response to current crises. The technological disclosure timeline that the observer described suggested that humanity's recent rapid advancement in certain scientific fields had been partially guided through selective revelation of principles that had been withheld during earlier developmental periods. Your recent breakthroughs in quantum computing, fusion energy, and materials science, the being explained, represent cases where we have allowed certain information to become available to your researchers through means that appear to be independent human discovery, but which actually involve subtle guidance towards specific theoretical frameworks that were ready for your civilization to access. The observer projected what appeared to be a roadmap, showing planned technology release schedules that were designed to provide humanity with capabilities we would need for cosmic integration while avoiding premature access to technologies we might misuse catastrophically. The next phase of this disclosure process, it continued, will involve allowing your scientists to achieve breakthrough understanding in several fields that will be necessary for you to comprehend the true nature of the contact that is approaching. Advances in consciousness research, quantum biology, and unified field theory that will provide frameworks for understanding how we operate and what cosmic civilization actually involves. The observer's explanation of how ordinary people around the world were experiencing preparation effects without consciously recognizing them as such included phenomena that I could verify through my own experience and observation of broader cultural trends. The increasing interest in meditation, consciousness exploration, and spiritual seeking outside traditional religious structures, the being explained, represents unconscious recognition that humanity is approaching a transformational period that requires new frameworks for understanding reality and consciousness. The observer projected data showing exponential growth in mindfulness practices, psychedelic research, and public interest in consciousness studies over recent decades. These trends are not being directly caused by our intervention, but they are being influenced by subtle electromagnetic and information field effects that we generate as we increase our presence in preparation for contact. The suggestion that the cosmic observers were already influencing human consciousness at mass scale through methods that remained below the threshold of conscious awareness was simultaneously fascinating and disturbing, raising questions about the degree to which humanity's apparent free will was actually operating within parameters established by extraterrestrial management. The final preparation phase that the observer described as beginning within the next 2 to 3 years would involve increasing disclosure of government knowledge about extraterrestrial contact, more frequent and more obvious UFO sightings, and acceleration of technological breakthroughs that would prepare humanity for the capability we would encounter during open contact. The governments that have been managing information about our presence for decades, the being explained, are receiving increasing pressure to disclose what they know, both from internal whistleblowers and from the reality that our increased visibility is making the old secrecy protocols unsustainable. The Observer projected scenarios showing gradual official acknowledgement of non-human intelligence, release of previously classified footage and documents, and eventually formal government statements confirming that Earth has been under observation and that contact is approaching. This disclosure process is designed to be gradual enough that it doesn't cause social collapse, but rapid enough that humanity has time to adjust psychologically before the actual return occurs, it continued. By the time the mothership arrives and Jesus appears to validate religious prophecies while revealing cosmic context, a significant portion of humanity will have already accepted that extraterrestrial intelligence exists and that we have been interacting with Earth for thousands of years. As the Observer concluded its explanation of the timeline and the signs that would mark the approach of the return, I found myself experiencing a strange mixture of excitement at the magnitude of transformation humanity would soon experience and terror at the challenges we would face during the preparation and transition periods. Sergeant Thompson, the being communicated with what I had learned to recognize as deep respect for the psychological burden I was carrying. You are among the first humans outside the highest levels of government and military leadership to receive this complete understanding of what is approaching and when it will occur. The knowledge you possess creates both opportunity and responsibility. You have the ability to help prepare others for the transformation that is coming, but you also carry the burden of knowing truths that most of humanity is not yet ready to accept. The Observer's golden eyes held steady contact as it delivered what felt like both warning and encouragement. The next 2 years will be critical for determining not just when the return occurs, but how humanity responds when it does. Your choices about how to use the knowledge you have gained here will influence that outcome in ways that may seem small from your individual perspective, but which could have significant effects on the larger process of preparing humanity for cosmic integration. As I left Cell 12 at the end of my shift, I understood that I had been given not just information, but a mission, and that my decision about whether to remain silent or find ways to share what I had learned would determine whether I was complicit in keeping humanity ignorant, or whether I would risk everything to help prepare my species for the most important moment in our history, a transformation that would begin within the next 7 to 10 years and would change forever what it means to be human. The access codes that appeared in my secure email inbox 3 days after the Observer revealed the timeline for the return carried no explanation or instructions, just a series of alphanumeric sequences that I recognized as authorization credentials for classified databases far beyond my official clearance level. I stared at the message for several minutes, trying to determine whether it was a test of my loyalty, a trap to catch me accessing unauthorized materials, or genuine invitation to discover information that would provide context for the revelations I had received in Cell 12. The credentials are genuine, the Observer confirmed during my next shift, clearly aware through our telepathic connection of my discovery and my hesitation about using them. You are being given access to historical records that will help you understand how long your government has known about the approaching return, and what preparations have been made during the decades since that knowledge was first shared with human leadership. The being's tone carried what seemed to be approval for whoever had provided the access codes. This is not accident or coincidence. You are being prepared for a role that extends beyond guarding my cell. The classified archive that the credentials unlocked contained documentation spanning more than 70 years of secret meetings between the Observer and successive U.S. presidents, along with records of parallel communications with leaders of other major nations who had been briefed about extraterrestrial presence and the planned timeline for open contact. The first document I accessed was dated February 1954 and described a meeting at a location that official records claimed President Eisenhower had spent visiting family, but which the classified files revealed had actually been a face-to-face encounter with the Observer and 2 other extraterrestrial representatives. The meeting notes, written in Eisenhower's own hand, showed a leader struggling to process information that challenged everything he believed about America's place in the world and humanity's place in the cosmos. They showed me evidence that cannot be denied, Eisenhower had written. We are not alone. We have never been alone, and everything we think we know about human history and divine purpose must be reconsidered in light of truths that are both terrifying and magnificent beyond our capacity to fully comprehend. The subsequent presidential briefings documented in the archive showed a pattern of each new administration being brought into the secret, receiving updated assessments of the timeline for contact, and making decisions about how to prepare America and the world for revelations that would transform human civilization. Kennedy had focused on space program development as preparation for eventual cosmic integration, his notes indicating he believed that achieving the moon landing would help humanity psychologically prepare for the reality of traveling beyond Earth. Nixon had overseen expansion of underground facility construction, the files revealing a massive network of deep underground military bases, ostensibly built for continuity of government during nuclear war, but actually designed to provide secure locations for managing the transition period when extraterrestrial contact became public. Reagan had attempted to use his famous alien threat speech to begin public preparation, testing whether humanity could be united by the concept of external challenges that exceeded national boundaries, though his advisors had convinced him that explicit disclosure would cause more harm than benefit, given Cold War tensions and nuclear arsenals that remained on hair-trigger alert. The infrastructure projects documented in the archive revealed systematic preparation for the contact event on a scale that exceeded anything I had imagined, including facilities that I had worked at during my military career, without understanding their true purpose. The deep underground command centers that I had been taught were designed for nuclear war survival were actually equipped with communication systems designed for interspecies dialogue, atmospheric controls that could accommodate non-human biological requirements, and medical facilities that could handle injuries or illnesses that might result from human exposure to extraterrestrial biology or technology. The satellite networks that officially monitored for missile launches were simultaneously tracking extraterrestrial craft movements and collecting data that helped the cosmic observers assess human technological development. Even Area 51 itself, which I had thought was primarily about containing alien prisoners and reverse engineering recovered technologies, was actually functioning as the primary interface facility where government officials could receive updates about the approaching return and coordinate preparation activities with the observer and other extraterrestrial representatives. The psychological operations programs documented in the archive showed decades of subtle public conditioning designed to make the concept of extraterrestrial life more acceptable while avoiding the kind of disclosure that might cause social collapse before adequate preparation had been completed. The gradual release of UFO footage through official military channels, the increasing scientific discussion of exoplanets and the probability of life elsewhere in the universe, and even the proliferation of science fiction media exploring themes of alien contact were revealed to be partially managed processes designed to acclimate public consciousness to concepts that would soon become undeniable reality. The goal, explained a memo from a 1980s National Security Council meeting, is to ensure that when disclosure occurs, the majority of the population has already considered the possibility of extraterrestrial intelligence and has mental frameworks for processing that reality without experiencing the kind of existential crisis that could lead to social breakdown or violent resistance to cosmic integration. The selection criteria documented in files about my own recruitment to Project Sentinel revealed that my assignment to guard Cell 12 had been anything but random, but rather represented the culmination of psychological profiling that had been ongoing since I first enlisted in the Marines 8 years earlier. The files showed that military personnel with specific psychological characteristics were being systematically identified and gradually moved toward positions where they could receive direct exposure to extraterrestrial reality while being evaluated for potential roles in the disclosure and transition process. Subject Thompson read an assessment report dated 6 months before my transfer to Area 51, demonstrates optimal combination of traits including strong religious faith that provides moral foundation, critical thinking capability that prevents dogmatic rigidity, proven ability to process traumatic information without psychological breakdown, and communication skills that could be valuable for public education during disclosure phase. The realization that I had been selected, groomed, and positioned for a specific role in the cosmic contact timeline was simultaneously flattering and deeply disturbing, raising questions about how much of my career and life choices had been guided by invisible hands working toward purposes I hadn't understood. The observer's confirmation of my deliberate selection provided context that made the grooming process seem less like manipulation and more like necessary preparation for responsibilities that couldn't be assigned to unprepared individuals. The government officials who manage preparation for the return, the being explained, understand that they cannot maintain secrecy indefinitely as the contact date approaches, and that controlled disclosure through credible individuals will be more effective than allowing panic to spread when the mothership arrives without warning. The telepathic communication carried layers of meaning that suggested the observer had been involved in my selection process from the beginning. You were identified as someone who could serve as bridge between military authority and civilian population, someone whose faith background would allow you to address religious concerns, while your military training would provide credibility for the technological and security aspects of the revelation. The being's golden eyes held what seemed to be both respect and expectation. Your role is not to reveal classified information prematurely or to violate your security oaths, but rather to be prepared to speak publicly when official disclosure begins, providing testimony that can help others process the reality of extraterrestrial presence and the approaching return. The timeline for the disclosure process, documented in the most recent archive files, indicated that my testimony would be needed much sooner than I had anticipated, with plans for phased revelation beginning within the next 18 to 24 months. The first phase, explained a memo from a recent National Security Council meeting, will involve official government acknowledgement that UFO phenomena represent genuine encounters with non-human intelligence, supported by release of classified footage and testimony from military personnel who have had direct contact experiences. I recognized several names on the list of individuals who had been selected to provide public testimony, including fighter pilots who had engaged with craft displaying impossible flight characteristics, radar operators who had tracked objects that violated known physics, and intelligence analysts who had documented patterns in extraterrestrial visitation that indicated systematic monitoring of human military and technological facilities. The second phase, the memo continued, will expand disclosure to include acknowledgement of recovered non-human technology and biological materials, preparing public consciousness for the revelation that we have been in communication with extraterrestrial representatives for decades. The final phase, scheduled to occur 12 to 18 months after the initial disclosure began, would involve introducing the observer and other extraterrestrial representatives directly to the public, explaining the true history of human-alien interaction, and revealing the timeline for the return that would culminate the preparation process. As I processed the implications of the government's long-term knowledge of the approaching return and the systematic preparation that had been ongoing for decades, I found myself experiencing a mixture of relief that I wasn't facing this knowledge alone, and anger that the truth had been kept from humanity, while leaders made decisions about our collective future without democratic input or public awareness. The secrecy was not maintained to serve government interests, the observer explained, clearly sensing my emotional turmoil through our telepathic connection, but rather to protect humanity from revelations that would have caused catastrophic social disruption before adequate preparation had been completed. The being projected what appeared to be sociological models showing how premature disclosure during earlier decades could have triggered religious extremism, international conflict, or economic collapse that would have made humanity less capable of handling the actual contact event when it occurred. The gradual approach allows for psychological adjustment across generations, technological development that makes cosmic integration possible, and social evolution toward the kind of unified frameworks that will be necessary for humanity to speak with one voice when the mothership arrives and offers you the choice between cosmic integration or continued planetary isolation. The final document in the archive that I accessed was a letter addressed personally to me, written by the current president and classified at levels that ensured it would never appear in any historical record or official documentation. Sergeant Thompson, the letter began, you have been chosen to carry knowledge that will burden you in ways that those who have not faced this responsibility cannot fully understand. The truth about our cosmic context and the approaching transformation challenges everything we have been taught about human autonomy, divine purpose, and the nature of reality itself. The president's words reflected genuine understanding of the psychological weight I was carrying. Your role in the coming disclosure will be voluntary. You can choose to remain silent and allow others to carry the message, or you can speak publicly when the time comes and help your fellow citizens process truths that will reshape our understanding of who we are and where we are going as a species. The letter concluded with an acknowledgement that the choice would have profound personal consequences regardless of which path I chose. If you speak, you will face ridicule, accusations of mental illness, and possibly threats from those who prefer comfortable lies to transformative truth. If you remain silent, you will carry the burden of wondering whether your testimony might have helped others prepare for the most important moment in human history. Either way, you will never be able to return to the simple certainties that characterized your life before you learned that we are not alone and that humanity's graduation into cosmic civilization approaches with each passing day. As I left the archive and returned to my quarters, I understood that I had been given not just information, but a mission, and that my decision about whether to accept that mission would determine whether I lived the rest of my life as a silent guardian of secrets that could save humanity or as a prophet speaking truths that most people weren't ready to hear. The decision to share what I had learned with other guards at the facility was driven by both practical necessity and moral obligation. If the observer was telling the truth about the approaching return and my role in preparing humanity, I couldn't fulfill that responsibility working alone. And if multiple guards could verify the same information independently, it would provide additional confirmation that I wasn't experiencing elaborate delusion or psychological manipulation. Sergeant Maria Santos had been guarding Cell 7 for 3 years and had developed the same kind of questioning mindset that I recognized in myself, asking questions during our occasional breaks together about the nature of the beings we protected, and whether the government's stated purposes for containing them aligned with what we observed during our shifts. "Maria," I said during one such break, keeping my voice low despite the secure room we occupied, "have you ever wondered whether the entities we're guarding might know things about human history and the future that our commanding officers aren't telling us?" Her eyes narrowed with the kind of careful assessment that came from years of military service learning to distinguish between legitimate inquiry and potential security violations. "Every day," she replied after a moment of evaluation. "Cell 7's occupant has been trying to communicate with me telepathically for months, sharing information about events that I can verify actually occurred, but which it shouldn't have any knowledge about if it's just been imprisoned here since 2003. The group that formed over the next 2 weeks included 6 guards who had all been experiencing similar phenomena: telepathic communication with the beings they protected, exposure to information that challenged their understanding of history and reality, and growing awareness that their role at the facility extended beyond conventional security duties. Staff Sergeant James Mitchell guarded Cell 4 and reported that his assigned entity had shared detailed information about ancient civilizations that predated recorded history, including technological capabilities that shouldn't have existed according to conventional archaeological understanding. Corporal David Chen protected Cell 9 and had received communications about humanity's future trajectory and the timeline for open extraterrestrial contact that matched what the observer had told me almost exactly. Specialist Sarah Williams monitored Cell 3, the same being I had first seen during my initial tour of Sector 7, and had been shown holographic evidence of the Roswell incident from the alien perspective, revealing that the crash hadn't been accidental, but rather a deliberate surrender by beings who wanted to establish communication with human authorities. The consistency of information across multiple independent sources suggested either a coordinated effort by the imprisoned entities to influence their guards, or genuine sharing of accurate knowledge about cosmic reality that we had all been selected to receive for purposes that extended beyond our official security assignments. Our informal investigation revealed that all 12 entities held in Sector 7 were telling fundamentally consistent stories about extraterrestrial monitoring of Earth, the timeline for open contact, and the role that religious prophecy had played in preparing humanity for eventual cosmic integration. The variations in their accounts reflected different species' perspectives and different levels of involvement in the monitoring program. But the core narrative remained remarkably stable across all sources. They're not just making this up or coordinating their stories. Maria observed during one of our clandestine meetings in a maintenance area that we had verified was free from surveillance equipment. Multiple species from different star systems, some of whom have been enemies with each other according to what they've told us, are all confirming the same basic timeline and the same assessment of where humanity stands in the cosmic evaluation process. The implications were staggering. Either we were all experiencing synchronized delusions, or we were receiving accurate information about the most significant transformation in human history from beings who had direct knowledge of plans that were being coordinated at interstellar scales. The discovery of the government's narrative management protocols came when David Chen used security credentials similar to the ones I had received to access planning documents about the disclosure timeline and public communication strategies. The files revealed comprehensive programs designed to control how information about extraterrestrial contact would be released, what aspects of the truth would be emphasized or downplayed, and how public reaction would be monitored and shaped through media management, religious leader coordination, and strategic deployment of credible witnesses like ourselves. Phase 1 messaging, read one document dated from 6 months earlier, should emphasize that UFO phenomena represent genuine encounters with advanced non-human intelligence, while avoiding details about the duration and extent of government knowledge about extraterrestrial presence. Public should be allowed to believe that we are learning about this reality in real time alongside them, rather than being forced to confront decades of systematic deception by trusted institutions. The cynical manipulation evident in the communication strategy raised serious questions about whether the government's disclosure plans were designed to serve public interest or to protect institutional authority from the consequences of revelations that would undermine trust in governmental honesty and transparency. The narrative control protocols extended to detailed plans for managing religious responses to disclosure, with specific strategies outlined for working with Christian, Islamic, Jewish, Hindu, and Buddhist leaders to frame the extraterrestrial revelations in ways that would minimize theological disruption while gradually shifting religious understanding toward acceptance of cosmic context for spiritual truth. Christian messaging should emphasize that extraterrestrial monitoring of Earth is consistent with divine providence, and that the return of Jesus in the company of advanced beings represents fulfillment of biblical prophecy rather than contradiction of core Christian teachings. Explained a memo directed to liaison officers assigned to work with evangelical leadership. Islamic outreach should focus on Quranic references to life throughout the cosmos and Allah's creation of multiple intelligent species, framing disclosure as confirmation of religious truth rather than challenge to faith foundations. The systematic approach to managing religious reaction showed both sophisticated understanding of how different faith traditions might respond to cosmic revelation and troubling willingness to manipulate theological interpretation to serve governmental interests in maintaining social stability during the transition period. Our group's growing awareness of the scope of governmental planning and the approaching timeline for disclosure forced us to confront difficult questions about our own roles in the process and whether we would cooperate with the managed narrative or seek ways to share unfiltered truth with the public. "They've planned everything," James Mitchell said during one of our meetings, his voice carrying frustration that bordered on anger. "They know exactly when they're going to tell people, exactly how they're going to frame the information, and exactly how they're going to use people like us to validate their version of events, while leaving out the parts that might make citizens question why they were lied to for 70 years. The moral dilemma was clear. We could cooperate with the official disclosure process and help manage public reaction according to governmental preferences, or we could break our security oaths and share what we knew through independent channels, risking court-martial, imprisonment, or worse consequences that had been hinted at in the warnings we had received about the penalties for unauthorized disclosure of classified information related to extraterrestrial contact. The turning point came when we discovered evidence that the government's disclosure timeline was being accelerated, not because optimal preparation conditions had been achieved, but rather because maintaining secrecy was becoming impossible as the extraterrestrial presence increased in visibility, and as more personnel like ourselves gained access to information they felt morally obligated to share. Internal threat assessment, read a classified memo from just 2 weeks earlier, indicates increasing probability of unauthorized disclosure from personnel assigned to direct contact with non-human entities. Recommend acceleration of Phase 1 public messaging to establish official narrative before independent leaks can create information chaos that would undermine managed transition process. The realization that we were considered potential threats to be managed rather than trusted partners in humanity's preparation for cosmic contact crystallized our group's determination to find ways to share truth on our own terms rather than waiting for governmental authorization that might never come or might arrive only in forms so sanitized and controlled that they would perpetuate deception rather than enabling genuine understanding. "We have to tell people what's really happening," Sarah Williams stated with conviction that reflected growing consensus among our group. "Not through official channels that will filter and distort the message, but directly to anyone who will listen, accepting whatever consequences come from choosing truth over comfortable lies and institutional loyalty." As we prepared to determine the specifics of how we would share our knowledge while minimizing risks to ourselves and maximizing the likelihood that our testimony would be received and believed, I realized that the observer's prediction about my role in the disclosure process was manifesting in ways I hadn't anticipated, and that the choice between silence and testimony was no longer theoretical, but rather an immediate decision that would determine whether I was remembered as a guardian of government secrets, or as someone who risked everything to warn humanity that we were being watched, evaluated, and would soon face the most important test in our species' history. The summons to Commander Walsh's office came at 0600 hours on a Tuesday morning, delivered not through normal channels, but by two armed security personnel whose presence and demeanor made it clear this wasn't a routine administrative meeting. As I walked through corridors that had become familiar over months of service at Area 51, I noticed that the other members of our informal investigation group were also being escorted by security teams, all of us converging on the administrative section at the same time, in a coordination that suggested our activities had been discovered and that we were facing consequences far more serious than standard disciplinary procedures. The observer's telepathic warning reached me just as I approached Walsh's office door, the mental communication carrying urgency that I had never before detected in the being's normally calm presence. "You have been discovered," the voice in my mind stated with crystalline clarity. "Your group's investigation triggered security monitoring systems, and the decision has been made to classify all of you as unacceptable security risks. What they are calling reassignment is actually authorization for permanent elimination. You will not leave this facility alive unless you take action immediately." The warning was accompanied by what felt like downloaded information about security procedures, guard rotations, and vulnerable points in the facility's surveillance coverage that the observer had apparently been observing and analyzing during its 76 years of imprisonment. Commander Walsh's expression when we were assembled in her office confirmed the observer's warning before she spoke a single word. This wasn't disappointment or anger about security violations, but rather the cold professional assessment of someone who had been authorized to solve a problem through whatever means necessary. "Sergeants Thompson, Santos, Mitchell, Chen, Williams, and Corporal Rodriguez," she began, using our formal ranks and full names in a way that emphasized the official nature of what was about to occur. "Security analysis has determined that your unauthorized access to classified materials, your coordination of independent investigation activities, and your discussions about sharing sensitive information with unauthorized personnel represent Level 1 security breaches that cannot be remediated through standard disciplinary procedures." She pulled up documents on her screen that I recognized as authorization forms for what the military euphemistically called permanent reassignment to deep cover operations. Terminology that everyone in the intelligence community understood meant sanctioned elimination of individuals whose knowledge or actions made them unacceptable risks to classified programs. "Effective immediately, you are all being transferred to a secure holding facility pending final processing of your cases," Walsh continued, though the absence of any mention of legal representation, appeal procedures, or timeline for resolution made it clear that processing was merely administrative preparation for our elimination. The transport that was supposed to take us to the secure holding facility represented our only opportunity for escape, as the observer had explained through the tactical information it had downloaded into my consciousness during its warning. The vehicle would travel through portions of the facility and then across open desert before reaching whatever location had been designated for our final processing, and there would be a brief window during the transition from underground corridors to surface roads when security protocols would be temporarily reduced, and escape might be possible for those willing to accept the enormous risks involved in attempting to flee from a maximum security military installation in the middle of the Nevada desert. When the transport stops at Gate 7 for identification verification, the observer's telepathic voice instructed as we were being loaded into the armored vehicle. "The electromagnetic locks on your restraints will experience a failure that will last exactly 47 seconds. The surveillance cameras covering that checkpoint will simultaneously malfunction. You must use that window to exit the vehicle. neutralize the guards using the combat techniques you were trained in, and reach the civilian maintenance vehicles parked 80 meters northeast of the checkpoint. The precision of the escape plan and the observer's apparent ability to manipulate electronic systems throughout the facility raised questions about how much control the being actually possessed, despite its imprisonment. But there was no time to contemplate those implications as our transport began moving through the underground corridors toward the surface. The escape unfolded exactly as the observer had described, with a precision that suggested the being had been observing and planning for this possibility for much longer than just the few minutes since my warning. When the transport stopped at Gate 7, and I felt my restraints suddenly release, the other members of my group responded with the same trained combat efficiency that had made us valuable military personnel before we became security liabilities. The two guards inside the transport were neutralized within seconds, using techniques designed to incapacitate without killing, while Maria Santos disabled the exterior security with practiced efficiency that spoke to capabilities that exceeded what her official training should have provided. The maintenance vehicle that we commandeered had been left with keys in the ignition and a full tank of fuel in what could only have been observer-arranged preparation for our escape, and within 90 seconds of the electromagnetic lock failure, all 6 of us were racing across the desert in a vehicle that would hopefully be mistaken for routine maintenance traffic, long enough for us to reach areas beyond the facility's immediate security perimeter. The pursuit began before we had traveled 5 miles, with military helicopters appearing in the desert sky behind us and radio communications confirming that our escape had been discovered and that all available security resources were being mobilized to prevent us from leaving the restricted area around Area 51. "They're not going to let us just drive away," James Mitchell stated, what everyone already understood, his voice carrying the same calm assessment that had characterized his behavior during combat deployments in Iraq. "We need to split up, use different routes, and hope that some of us get far enough to share what we know before they catch everyone." The strategy was sound but grim in its implications. Dividing our group would increase the likelihood that at least some testimony would reach the public, but it would also mean that most of us would probably be caught and face consequences that we could only imagine. The observer's final telepathic message reached me as we approached a junction where the access road split into multiple directions toward different towns and highways. "Your mission is not to evade capture indefinitely," the being communicated, "but rather to survive long enough to share the truth about what is approaching. Use the information I have given you. Trust the contacts whose names are now in your memory, and understand that your sacrifice serves purposes that extend far beyond your individual survival." The separation of our group at the highway junction was both tactically necessary and emotionally devastating, as we acknowledged that we were unlikely to see each other again, and that the next hours or days would determine whether our decision to pursue truth over security would result in humanity receiving warnings about the approaching return, or whether we would simply disappear into the same covert elimination systems that had silenced other individuals who had posed unacceptable risks to classified programs. Maria Santos headed north toward Reno with David Chen, planning to use her family contacts in media to share testimony if they survived long enough to reach civilian areas where military authority couldn't operate with impunity. James Mitchell and Sarah Williams went east toward Las Vegas, hoping that the city's crowds and constant surveillance might provide protection against overt elimination attempts, while they sought out independent journalists and alternative media outlets that might be willing to publish testimony that mainstream sources would dismiss or suppress. Corporal Rodriguez went south toward Arizona, carrying physical evidence that we had managed to secure during our time at the facility. Photographs, documents, and recordings that might provide verification for claims that would otherwise be dismissed as elaborate conspiracy theories or the delusions of mentally unstable individuals. I turned west toward California, carrying the most complete understanding of the observer's message and the timeline for the return, knowing that my testimony would be the most detailed and the most challenging for listeners to accept, but also knowing that the observer had specifically identified me as being prepared for the role of warning humanity about transformations that approached with each passing day. The next 72 hours became a desperate race across the American Southwest, using cash that we had accumulated in preparation for this possibility, avoiding surveillance cameras and digital payment systems that could track our movements, and constantly moving to prevent security forces from predicting our locations and establishing capture operations. The safe houses whose addresses the observer had somehow placed in my memory proved to be real locations maintained by individuals who asked no questions but provided food, rest, and transportation that kept me moving toward destinations where I might find audiences willing to hear testimony about Area 51, imprisoned extraterrestrials, and the return of Jesus in the company of advanced beings who had been monitoring humanity for millennia. The news reports that I monitored through burner phones and public internet access showed that our escape had been contained from public awareness, with no official acknowledgement that security personnel from a classified facility were being hunted across multiple states. But I knew that absence of public information didn't mean absence of pursuit, and that every hour I remained free was a temporary victory that could end at any moment with capture and elimination that would never be officially acknowledged. As I prepared to record the testimony that I hoped would reach audiences before I was caught, I understood that the observer had been preparing me not just to understand cosmic truth, but to become a messenger whose sacrifice might help humanity prepare for the most important moment in our history, and that my mission now involved not escape, but rather successful transmission of warnings that could transform how billions of people understood their faith, their history, and their future in a universe far more populated and purposeful than they had ever imagined. If you're hearing this recording, then I either succeeded in getting this information out before they caught me, or I'm already dead, and someone found the backup copies I've hidden in locations across 3 states. My name is Sergeant Jacob Thompson. I served 8 years in the United States Marine Corps, and for the past 6 months I was assigned to guard extraterrestrial prisoners at Area 51 in Nevada. Everything I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, blasphemous, or insane, but I've seen the evidence with my own eyes. I've communicated telepathically with beings who have observed Earth for thousands of years, and I've accessed classified government files that confirm humanity is approaching the most important transformation in our history. The reason I'm risking my life and my freedom to share this information is because you deserve to know the truth about who we are, where we came from, and what's about to happen when Jesus Christ returns to Earth in the company of advanced extraterrestrial beings who have been preparing humanity for cosmic integration since before recorded history began. The beings held at Area 51 are real. I've stood face to face with 12 different extraterrestrial species. I've watched them communicate through methods that exceed human capabilities, and I've learned that they've been monitoring our planet for at least 12,000 years. The one I spoke with most extensively calls itself an observer and has been in U.S. government custody since the Roswell crash in 1947, but it's not a prisoner in the way we understand that term. It volunteered to be captured so it could establish communication with human authorities and begin preparing us for eventual open contact. What it told me, and what I verified through classified archives and holographic evidence that cannot be faked, is that Jesus of Nazareth was one of their kind, sent on an educational mission 2,000 years ago to accelerate humanity's moral development and prepare us for the day when we would be ready to join the larger community of conscious civilizations that populate the universe. His miracles were real. His crucifixion and resurrection actually occurred, but the mechanisms were advanced technology rather than supernatural divine power, and his message about love, forgiveness, and the kingdom of heaven was preparation for cosmic truth that most Christians have interpreted metaphorically, but which is about to become literal reality. The second coming that Christians have been waiting for is not metaphorical or spiritual, but a planned physical event scheduled to occur within the next 7 to 10 years, depending on whether humanity achieves specific developmental milestones that indicate we're ready for open contact. A mothership is currently positioned beyond our solar system, conducting final preparations and monitoring Earth's progress. And when the time is right, Jesus will return in the company of advanced beings to evaluate humanity's moral development and determine whether we're ready for full integration into cosmic civilization, or whether we need continued isolation and guidance. This isn't divine judgment in the way traditional theology teaches. It's a systematic assessment of whether our species has developed the wisdom necessary to handle advanced capabilities without destroying ourselves or threatening others in the cosmic community. The governments of the world have known about this timeline since at least 1954, when President Eisenhower met directly with extraterrestrial representatives, and they've been preparing infrastructure and public consciousness for decades, while keeping the full truth classified to prevent social collapse before adequate preparation could be completed. The signs that the return is approaching are visible right now if you know what to look for, and I'm going to give you specific markers that you can verify through your own observation of global events and trends. First, watch for continued acceleration of UFO sightings and official government acknowledgement of unidentified aerial phenomena. This is not coincidence but deliberate increase in extraterrestrial visibility as they conduct final assessments and begin psychological preparation for open contact. The U.S. military has already started releasing footage and testimony about encounters with craft that display impossible flight characteristics, and you'll see more governments following this pattern of gradual disclosure over the next 2 years. Second, pay attention to technological breakthroughs in quantum computing, fusion energy, and consciousness research. These developments are being guided through subtle intervention to ensure humanity has the scientific frameworks necessary to understand the reality of cosmic civilization when contact occurs. Third, observe how global crises, including climate change, pandemic threats, and geopolitical tensions, are forcing humanity toward greater cooperation and unified responses that transcend national boundaries. These are the forcing functions that will either drive us toward the kind of species-level organization necessary for cosmic integration or reveal that we're not yet ready for that responsibility. The specific timeline markers that the observer shared with me include religious and political developments that will accelerate as the return date approaches. Watch for increasing dialogue between different faith traditions about the possibility of life beyond Earth and the theological implications of extraterrestrial intelligence. This conversation is already beginning in academic and religious circles, and you'll see it move into mainstream religious teaching over the next several years. Pay attention to movements toward global governance structures that can speak for humanity as a unified civilization rather than as competing nations. The United Nations and similar institutions will face pressure to expand their authority and effectiveness as the need for species-level decision-making becomes more apparent. Observe how artificial intelligence development and genetic engineering technologies force humanity to confront questions about the nature of consciousness and the boundaries of acceptable intervention in biological and cognitive systems. These ethical challenges are preparing us for the reality that consciousness exists in many forms throughout the universe, and that advanced civilizations routinely employ technologies that would seem godlike to less developed species. Most importantly, watch for official government disclosure about decades of extraterrestrial contact. This will begin cautiously with acknowledgement of UFO reality and will gradually expand to include admission of recovered non-human technology and eventually revelation of ongoing communication with extraterrestrial representatives who have been helping to prepare humanity for the transformation that approaches. If you want to verify what I'm telling you, start by researching the patterns I've described and comparing them to current global events. You'll find that the acceleration of technological development, the increasing visibility of UFO phenomena, and the mounting pressure for global cooperation are all following trajectories that suggest systematic preparation for a transformation rather than random historical developments. Look into the history of government UFO programs and the recent shift toward official acknowledgement of non-human intelligence, and ask yourself why authorities who have denied this reality for 70 years are suddenly willing to admit that we're encountering craft that display capabilities beyond known human technology. Talk to military personnel, intelligence analysts, and scientific researchers who work in classified programs, and you'll find that many of them are struggling with the same knowledge that I'm sharing. The awareness that we are not alone, that we have never been alone, and that the beings who have been watching us are preparing to make their presence undeniable. Most importantly, examine your own faith tradition with new eyes, looking for references to life beyond Earth, the return of divine messengers, and the transformation of human consciousness that virtually every major religion predicts. You'll find that the cosmic context I'm describing doesn't contradict these teachings, but rather provides a larger framework that makes them more comprehensible and more immediately relevant than most believers have understood. The coordinates I'm leaving with this recording mark locations where you can find additional evidence and testimony from the other soldiers who escaped Area 51 with me. We've hidden documents, photographs, and recordings in secure locations that can be accessed by following the instructions that will be released through encrypted channels over the coming months. Some of us will be caught or killed before we can complete our mission of warning humanity. But we've designed our disclosure strategy to ensure that the information survives, even if we don't. Contact the journalists whose names I'm including in the supplementary files. They've been investigating government UFO programs for years, and they have the credibility and the platforms to share this testimony with audiences who might dismiss the same information coming from unknown sources. Support the disclosure movement that's building momentum in military and intelligence communities. Because the more people who speak about what they've witnessed and what they know, the harder it will be for authorities to suppress the truth or control the narrative when official acknowledgement finally comes. Most importantly, prepare yourself and those you care about for revelations that will challenge everything you thought you knew about reality, history, and human purpose. The transformation that's coming will be difficult and disorienting, but it will also be the most amazing and hopeful event in human history if we approach it with wisdom rather than fear. If you're listening to this recording, then the clock has already begun counting down toward the most important moment in human history. The return will happen within your lifetime, possibly within the next decade, and how humanity responds when it occurs will determine whether we join the cosmic community as conscious participants in something larger than ourselves, or whether we remain isolated on this planet under continued monitoring and guidance until we develop the maturity necessary for integration. The choice isn't entirely ours. The extraterrestrial civilizations monitoring Earth will make their own assessment of our readiness based on criteria we can influence but don't fully control. But we can affect the outcome by choosing to develop the moral wisdom, the social cooperation, and the technological responsibility that will demonstrate we're ready for the next phase of our development. Watch the skies, pay attention to the signs, and prepare yourself for the day when everything you thought you knew about human history, divine purpose, and our place in the universe will be transformed by revelations that are both terrifying and magnificent beyond our capacity to fully comprehend.